Recorded, now removed.
Just... let someone witness me.
Is anyone still above?
One line struck, one life erased.
Another transfer, they say.
The city may forget, but the stone remembers.
The municipal records call it a procedural gap, a set of suppressed entries, a single phrase crossed and sealed. The town fathers call it municipal necessity, useful cruelty, the blunt instrument of order. The prison clerk who kept ledger named it bureaucratically, moving entries into a sieve. The city maps never let the shaft show. The cobblestones above the pit were ordinary, until a chronology began to measure the way shown behaved in that square. Measured against the cold functional detail of civic life, the Hole of Nuremberg was a failure of imagination. A cavity deep enough that the signs did not simply stop, but continued to bleed sound into the city above, long after their bodies had ceased to tremble. This third-person document traces what can be reconstructed from multiple ledgers, 3 surviving witness fragments, architectural surveys, and a single official confession that was locked behind 7 seals. They aim not to sensationalize, but to render the mechanisms and the human decisions. The chronicler records in a tone of detachment, because detachment the only tool that resists contagion. The work begins with arrest lists, with the dates stamped and the ink smudged by cellar damp, and moves down, step by step, into the organized choreography that funneled man and woman into a vertical void. The context is necessary. Nuremberg in the 15th century was a walled municipal republic where guilds and councils held sway. The judiciary was local severe and performative. Public punishments were spectacle, they affirmed authority, but spectacle is visible. The whole was sent the opposite way, an instrument of disappearance. It allowed officials to resolve problems that could not be reconciled publicly. The pit solved political embarrassment, obviated crowded galls, purified streets of unwanted modes. It transformed municipal control into an engineered form of silence. The chronicler's papers present the pit as a system. It was not a single night of panic or the act of a madman. It was a municipal project with tasks and roles, with a ledger to account for ropes and tallow and salted sacks. Warren Albrecht administered it as rigorously as he would a levy. He kept the keys, inspected the rope, calibrated the lamp oil ration in the cellar, and checked the seal on the shaft before every procession. The pit required maintenance. Wooden ladders that swallowed themselves in rot, a pulley improvised from guild tools, a bell that marked time. The instruments were crude and efficient. They were municipal appliances rather than theatrical devices. This bureaucratic character is critical. To call the whole monstrous is accurate, but it's more fresher to call it procedural. A model that looks like an administration. The physical structure, as reconstructed from stones and damp, was an inverted well chiseled into bedrock beneath a municipal cellar. From the courtyard above, a heavy oak jaw opened into a square shaft rimmed with worn stones. The shaft dropped abruptly into darkness. A rope, thickened by tar and repeated hands, ran to an iron ring and led to a pulley wheel. The bottom was never intended to be seen. Surveyors found a record that mentioned that the pit continued many fathoms and 10 distinct silence was recorded. Acoustic experiments with reconstruction indicate that the vertical cavity created a resonant column, a natural amplifier for human voice. Shows turned into long, gang tails. Sounds reflected in complete frequency back, stretched by structural geometry. The architecture engineered persistence. The air could be folded into thinking the suffering lasted longer than the body would permit if only because sound refused to settle. The process began with arrest. Citizens could be taken for common crime, death, political dissent, or for reasons that read now as caprice. The ledger lists charges in the third hand of municipal cries, vagabond heresy, obstruction of market, seditious rumor. Some entries are more revealing. Names appear with annotations such as quitted or sealed. Warden Albrecht in a deliberate script. He would read the names aloud as a man counting provisions. The prisoner was catalogued, bagged, and escorted with municipal ritual. The chronicler notes the ritual because it mattered. The ceremonial thinness of the process made the disappearance efficient. Procedural steps absorbed conscience. Once in the cellar, prisoners were kept in small cells with stones slick from mildew, chains clinkered. The chronicler notebook records the exact inventory for the descent. 1 hemp rope of municipal weave, 1 leather hood, 2 iron rings, short ladder, tar for the rope, a leather sack. The sack appears to have had a dual purpose. It was used as a container for personal effects and as a weight or drag in the descent. The prisoner bodies were described in a health register as gaunt, frequently ill, sometimes with marks of previous corporal punishment. The nameless prisoner is the composite reconstruction of 3 fragments of testimony that survive. The fragments are lean in details. The smell of wet stone, the sensation of rope under the feet, the understanding that the city above would continue unaware. The descent itself was held like a municipal ritual. The chronicler describes a slim choreography. A warden's guard, a counting, a bell, hands that check a knot, a lantern swung overhead to illuminate the rim. The rope lowered the prisoner to a ledge, and then the sound of a rope scraping iron synchronized it with the closing of the wooden hatch. There are procedural variations in records. Some show the prisoner bone and hold it, a sack rung up, and then release it. Others describe an escort who walked back to the cellars and left. The central constant is the pull, a clean motion of gravity meeting craft. The most haunting technical detail is acoustic. The pit did not merely extinguish life, it made a temporal artifact of seeing. The vertical walls, damp and irregular, trapped and diffracted sound channeling outwards. For harder descent, an odd phenomenon attended the shaft. People standing over the rim would hear faint repetitions of the last sounds emitted, as if the stone remembered breath. Witnesses called it echoing. Tom the chronicler prefers the term resonance. The city council attempted to treat the effect practically. Others assist directing that street markets be scheduled to cover certain hours, and relatively aims they made to mask the audible tale, which implicitly confirms the pit's acoustic persistence. This was not accidental. The town planned for the sonic residue. Acoustic detail appears in surprising municipal documents. A minute instructing that the grocers got be drawn to the square at the 7th hour. A mandate that the shoemakers hammering pause at noon. An ordinance advising that apprentices refrain from singing near the cellar. These are not metaphors. They are administrative responses to a reproducible physical phenomenon. A separate fragmentary memo, written perhaps by a man in Mason's craft, describes a crude experiment. An press set against the ledge, a bone held to stone, concluding that the shaft keeps the voice like an ember keeps heat. The chronicler says these are not as curiosities, but as evidence that civic engineering had to learn to contain what it had invented. There were variations in method depending on the value of the condemned. For those whose removal required plausible deniability, death had to look like misadventure. The municipal recorder shows staged files and slip cobblestones. For more inconvenient or noisy specs, processes are made elimination without ceremony. A tethered descent, a weighted sack, a lowered ladder that would not permit ascent. In one surviving sketch, the chroniclers are not in the shaft where a rope snagged and wore a groove into stone over years. That groove became part of the apparatus. The town optimized cruelty with the blunt calculus of repetition. The human dimension resists the colledger. The nameless prisoner's fragmentary recollection gives texture to routine. One fragment begins with a detail so small it might have been overlooked. The prisoner notes the wayward palm examining the palm of his hand as if checking for calluses, as if confirming the person's trade before disposal. Another fragment remembers scrap of folded paper, perhaps a letter or a prayer, kept in the fist more from habit than hope. A third fragment records a sound sequence made on the verve of rope release, a vowel smeared by fear. None of these fragments reaches the descent. They seize violently at the rope as slackening. The chronicler stitches those pieces together to assert the psychological effect, a deliberate collapse of identity. Prisoners became optional procedure. Binding and hooding removed the face from the civic equation. The process was designed to erase testimony. Some clerks tried in small ways to mark the erosion. Marginally record the clerk's tremor in ink, an awkward stanza of lemon, instructions to do what the after a cannot filed. One such marginal note reads, on the night of St. Leopold, 4 transported, family of 1 petitioned, stipend granted and oath sworn. The stipend was a small, a pittance for bread, conditional upon silence sworn before a notary. The chronicler includes because it illustrates a pattern. Financial exchange intent to conjoin compensation and forgetfulness. Warden Albrecht appears throughout the records like a constant footnote. He was not crude or hysterical. He was meticulous. His handwriting is square and deliberate. Houdeland supplies and measured time in one line. The chronicler finds the stats for remorseless administration transported for. Tar used half measure. Night bell struck thrice. He did not write about faces. The confession that bears his name, sealed behind 7 seals, produced once in private before a good inquisition, offers little by way of private conscience. It lists dates, matters, and rationales with the same flatness as the supply ledger. It is not a speak of penitence, but an inventory. There were occasional errors. Once a prisoner slipped from a rope too soon and lodged on a narrow ledge, an unplanned extended survival. The chronicler's follow-up entry notes the strained persistence of vocalization for 2 days, a stuttering sequence of breath and syllable. The municipal response was practical. They sent a small team down and retrieved the body, and then they revised rope knots, tested pulley bearings, and added a supplementary shackle. The incident is recorded not as moral catastrophe but as maintenance feedback. The ledger functions as an engineering manual for disappearance. After that event, the warden ordered additional tar, a thicker hemp, and the construction of a guard platform for descent. The instructions are precised down to the measure of tallow to be applied to the pulley. Secrecy relied on civic culture, silence enforced through ritual fear. Stories of the whole circulated in whispers, amplified by families of the missing. Warden Albrecht cultivated opacity through totemic gestures. Ornate iron keys, a ceremonial dagger kept as symbol, a ring of office heavy with municipal zerd. These symbols read as authority. They also created the necessary veil. Few asked questions when the warden moved through markets or coastal chambers. The chronicler attributed some of the peace longevity to social economy of fear. Merchants preferred stability. Good heads valued quick solution to disorder. Above all, they offered a municipal convenience, an end without spectacle. There were costs. The city paid in conscience and in practical complications. Sound did not respect municipal boundaries, and neighbors could sometimes hear the residual cries. In one account, a baker stopped his scene swinging at dawn because the acoustic residue seemed to ride the wind. He entered notes customers asking whether the bell had been struck too late. An attempt at municipal apology survived official ordinance that offered a small stipend to families who could demonstrate kinship with a missing person, provided they swore to silence. The chronicler notes the language of compensation because it reveals city's attempt to conflate exchange with absolution. The stipend was accompanied by a clause. The claimant must not proclaim falsehoods or disperse rumor concerning the municipal ways, a phrase that in effect legalized enforced forgetting. Resistance existed but was fragile. A handful of manuscripts showed that a small group sought to break the secrecy by exposing names and the hatch location. The effort culminated in a confrontation where a pamphlet with names was circulated and then burned publicly. The chronicler records the inevitable consequences: arrests, disappearances, and attaining a municipal control. Witness depositions from the aftermath, few and heavily redacted, describe it when lanterns were snuffed and men with iron ring cuffed toes who passed out leaflets. The pamphlet is described in one deposit as bearing several names and a crude map, and in another as an affront to the council. The whole for all its engineering depended on consensus. When that consensus faltered, it acted aggressively. The afterlife of the pit is an accumulation of details. A solitary shore on damp cobbles, a dark weathering on stones where the hatch had opened it, the sound of a bell timed like a heartbeat to drown memory. The chronicler ends this document not with a dramatic review but with inventory. The ledger of measured cruelty, one confessional statement sealed by officials, 3 fragments from a nameless prisoner, and the physical memory in stones and groups. Those materials permit reconstruction, but they cannot restore the people erased. The haunt consumed individual trajectories and left only echoes and municipal line items. The municipal reaction to exposure is instructive in its proceduralism. When rumors increased, the council issued orders, not for confession, but for greater organization. The warden must increase record keeping, the prison clerk must note costs by code, the bellman must ring on and adjust its schedule. There is no entry reading we were wrong. There is instead the citizenry's ledger of mitigation, as if to calculate grief into expense. One ordinance, drafted in a hand different from the warden's, reads like a contract. That the city maintain present order, that the means of elimination be kept with discretion, that claims be kin be answered with small stipend, that no man transgress the boundaries of council edict. The words discretion and order recur with the infrequency of moral language. If there is a juridical frame, it is found in the strategies of retention and erasure. Names were ciphered, hatches were bolstered, the urban soundscape was reorganized. Merchants shifted hours. Bell ringers learned to think of chiming as a kind of civic anesthetic. The chronicler notes these facts alongside her own unease. Policies that treated human disappearance as municipal maintenance are not statistical anomalies, but the rama of a certain governance. The confession, the sole official admission surviving behind 7 seals, is telling for what it does not say. It lists dates and quantities, named only in the sense of the accused of the transport. It offers a justificatory logic. That such a practice was necessary to avoid greater disorder, that the alternative would have been in public executions that inflamed factions, that the secrecy of the whole prevented uprisings. Yet it leaves to the interiority of the condemned. It is testimony without testimony, an admission that is in fact an instruction manual. The chronicler returns, in the last pages, to the issue of sound because it is the only way in which those erased make a prolonged presence. Even after records are burned, after the names are erased from rolls, and after the hatch sealed and cobbles relayed, the shaft's acoustic properties persist. The stone remembers more faithfully than paper. It holds a shape of loss. Acoustic experiments reproduced with care show that a human voice uttered on a lead will return a trace, a decaying shimmer of syllables, for an hour or more, depending on humidity and temperature. That technical fact intersects with the human one. The city tried to erase bodies, but not the physical memory of their last sound. The chronicler underlines this because it's where architecture lapses into ethics. A civic structure designed to remove people cannot altogether remove the traces they leave in matter. The last inventory is small and stark. A single should be a hatch, a ledger entry crossed and sealed, a ring of iron keys tarnished with damp. These are the ordinary things that outlast civic intentions. They accumulate like sediment and, though a later air, impart a fine unease. Those who walk the cobbles may never know why the air catch an indecipherable tell breath on a certain wind. Horrors somehow are made to vanish from memory. Some linger as an etch in stone. If there is a conclusion is juridical and existential, instruments eradication become normalized when procedural language displaces moral judgment. The Hole of Nuremberg is both device and mirror. It shows how citizens can rationalize cruelty as necessity and how civic architecture can be made to serve erasure. The chronicler writes to expose that process. The record is a warning, not merely a history. The town may have built a bit of weird inconvenient noise, but the sound of that solution lingers in the city's bones. The chronicler leaves the last image as inventory rather than flourish. A hatch-shielded and worn ledger full of measured cruelty, and a city that rang its bells not to comfort but to suppress a trailing human sound. The whole remains in the red and in the sound of memory, a civic failure to reckon with the human cost of silence. History tried to hide what is it. The ledger, when found, did not lie so much as it refuses to tell the whole truth. In consult, horrid hand ceremonial flourishes that recorded arrest, fines, and the bureaucratic removal of persons from the rolls of a city. Its columns are municipal names des crime sums. But beneath and between those columns there opens another column that was not meant for public reading, shorthand marks, crosses, and a peculiar municipal cipher that indicated consignments to the pit. The ledger is the pivot of the system, the hinge by which ordinary civic governance slid into systematic erasure. This chapter examines the ledger's role and the man who kept it, Warden Albrecht, and to him the mechanism by which a city normalized disappearing people. The chronicler records with clinical tone, emphasizing sequence, cause, and the texture of procedure. That tone is intentional. To make clear that terror is not only an act but the architecture that houses it. The ledger is architecture. The physical ledger occupied a small municipal room beneath the municipal hall. A damp closet of stone and low timber beams, warmed only by a flickering oil lamp, and the breath of bodies passing for official business. It lay upon a heavy oak table scarred with cuts and burns. The pages were thick wrapped paper, bound in leather softened by time. The first inspection noted the layered accretion of soot along the bending, the impression of repeated palm rests where hand had pressed too hard, and an eye. Irregular smearing or dark residue caught in the fibers, iron rust old blood, indistinguishable after years. The entries themselves are written in a clerk's hand, precise, with measured ascender and a methodical punctuation. The later additions, marginalia, slashes, and shortened are Warden Albrecht as swift, glitch strokes meant with a stub quill and held with the certainty of daily repetition. Warden Albrecht's presence in the ledger is as palpable as his physical presence in the prison. His handwriting is a signature of intent. In municipal roles he appears as necessary, stern, and firm-handed. In other rescues he stands beside the municipal seal as guarantor of order. The chronicler's mad demands appearance locked details be constant. Albrecht's uniform, heavy wool coat, leather brigandine beneath, an ornate ring of iron keys at his belt, recurs in every reference. The uniform is both protective armor and visual shorthand that authorizes his acts. Where the city needed a face to bear responsibility, Albrecht became that face, broad-shouldered, sallow, with deep-set eyes that did not so much see as catalogo. His gait is recorded repeatedly in third-party testimony. The measured step of a man who had rehearsed the road between ledger, cell, and shaft until it required no thought. The system he administered was procedural to the point of liturgy. Arrests were recorded in triplicate. A docket held at the guardhouse, a copy sent to the municipal clerk, and a third entry made in the ledger marked for special attention. Those special marks, two small vertical strokes in the margin followed by a dot, sometimes a diagonal cut through the line, translated into transfer to the pit. Public documentation never described the pit. The city's official vocabulary used vacuities, transferred, resigned, detained further. Where public paper used bureaucratic jargon, the ledger did not pretend to euphemize. The ledger kept an unvarnished record. The time a man or woman was taken from a cell and never returned, the stamp that permitted the transfer, and Albrecht's notation that the proper seals had been affixed. The chronicler transcribed numerous entries to demonstrate pattern. A typical entry reads, in clerical script, Johann Koppler F. Minor, arrested 10/17/2009. Docket 317, in the margin, Albrecht scrolled, and beneath, in a smaller hand, pitch transit 10/17 IV. Ropes hook issued. That margin is where the ledger stops being a civic log and becomes a manual. There was chorography to the transfers. The chronicler reconstructed it from ledger notations, guard routines, and architectural plans. A cell would be cleared at dusk. The guard posted outside would read the names from a curled scrap of paper. At the threshold, the prisoner would be shackled with narrow iron that left a clean breeze and a pale ring. The shackles were of a municipal pattern, described in a technical note with measurements and material. Iron band 1.5 inches wide, clasped with triple rivet. A rope, made of hemp treated with tar to preserve in damp conditions, was prepared and tested for fray. The municipal bell signaled movement. The keys were drawn from the ornate ring, and the heavy iron door would creak in the candlelight. Warden Albrecht would count aloud, an articulated sequence of numbers that functioned both as record and ritual. He counted not to admonish the prisoner but to place the act inside a public cadence. Counting enclosed the transfer in civility. There is a ceremonial rhythm to murder when it is institutionalized. Crumting, stamp sealing. The pit itself was not simply a hole. It was a built instrument, a shaft bored deliberately at the foundation stone the city's undercroft and integrated, be designed into the municipal infrastructure. The shaft's mouth was ringed with a reinforced wooden frame. The chronicler sketches show iron hoops sunk into the stone to secure ropes. The walls of the shaft were hewn, not left to chance. Builders lined a section with brick and fitted projection points where hooks could be fastened. Narrow ledges and handholds were cut at intervals, some intended to mislead and trap. The bottom of the shaft widened into a larger cavity, a cul-de-sac of stone and damp air where a person might linger, disoriented. As sound traveled oddly in the enclosed space, screams behave differently in that architecture. The chronicler, railing on survivor testimony and observation, produced a diagram of actual paths. A voice dropped down the shaft would hit cold stone, bones of brickwork, and be channeled through small vents into adjacent drains and cellarways. The result not a single sound but a chorus of recirculating noise. A scream returning at intervals, attenuated, tenre amplified by the cavity's resonances. Men who worked at the market above could testify to nights when the cobbles seemed to breathe with distant, intermittent cry. The city learned to ignore it. The chronicler's acoustic map notes the precise frequency bands most amplified by the shaft. A range corresponding to human wail and cough, such that ordinary conversation masked it. This is not incidental. It is part of the construction of oblivion. It was Warden Albrecht who maintained the engineering of indifference. He kept a roster of the shaft's maintenance. He ordered timber replaced, hooks reseamed, ropes tested. His ledger not only authorized consignments but budgeted for repairs. Entries detailing purchases of hemp, new iron hooks forged by municipal smiths, tar for rope preservation, lantern oil, and masonry work appear alongside transfer notations. Discipline like lie and administrative justification and infrastructure of disappearance. One repeated ledger notation reads ropes, saw else secure ends places. Tar bale bay, hook bone oil high cast. The chronicler appraises this entry as damning. They revealed that the transmissible machinery of disappearance was deliberate and sustained. The warden's stewardship of resources is an index of municipal investment in the pit as an instrument of governance. Against the ledgers formally stands a nameless prisoner, a composite testimony assembled from fragments and interviews. He provides the human counterpoint. Sensory particulars the ledger cannot contain. His memories are not chronological but layered impressions. The sharp coat of stone against the ebony, the metallic test at the back of the throat, the repeated scrape of hemp on skin. He remembers the way the light shrank around the oil lamp until it became no more than a fat ember, and the world beyond the light were absent. He remembers Albrecht's gloved hand. The hand was ceremonial and impersonal at once, a hand that prepared ropes and clipped a shackle with practiced efficiency. The prisoner's account of being bound includes small details that match ledger practice. The knot under the knee to prevent slipping, the placement of a loop at the waist. The prisoner carried the mark of the city, a ring of iris bruised across the ankle, as a private ledger of pain. Those who survive transfer to the pit, and survival is an ambiguous word here. For it can mean a release from the shaft after an indeterminate interval or a return to the surface in a state the city could easily expunge. Recounted experience of waiting. The waiting was designed at torment. Once lowered into a side chamber or left at a ledge, voices were delayed and returned as if played through distorting glass. Hunger and thirst were instruments. The city did not need to brand flesh openly because it could administer forgetting in small increments. No water for horse, a smear of bread, light so diminished it could not hold time. Several survivors describe a time in terms of sensations rather than hours. Long as the rope smelled or short as the light lasted. Such measures are legible to those who have been reduced to duration of tethers and flames. The chronicler records include careful drawings of rope knots and weight distribution methods. There are entries describing rows having particular phrase. A city's rope library, one ledger line reads as significant as its armory. Specific knots are catalogued. Flemish ice splice for secure ropes. A slip loop for quick release rarely used. A double half-hitch set to hold against a ledge. The chronicler notes that certain knots were used to wrap rather than support. Loops designed to catch on stone edges and hold a body suspended in an awkward, painful position until the person weakened. The ledger contains diagrammed with annotations such as trap hitch, holds a tamico with rough stone points, and spine stress noted 30.210. These procedural details are the most damning. They show calculation. It is one thing to sentence. It is another to design the means by which the sentence extends into prolonged suffering. As municipal spectacle morphed into municipal secrecy, public punishment that had once been deliberate, stocks, floggings, humiliation in the square, were transferred beneath the cobbles into an apparatus of disappearance. The city traded visible terror for a quieter, more efficient terror. The ledgers only provided plausible deniability. A transfer explained as an administrative reassignment diffused culpability. Families who came to the courthouse seeking kin were shown procedural forms and sent away when the papers declared that the subject had been returned to custody for further investigation. The chronicler documents how labels were used to erase the language of death, how bureaucracy could replace visible scenes of atrocity with administrative euphemism. One file contained copies of lists of families. In accordance with municipal courts, the subject remains detained pending proceedings. The formality of those phrases blanket the more immediate reality. The warden's remorselessness evident not only in ledger strokes, but in personal habits. He removed his gloves to issue orders, a small ceremonial act that signified trust in the city's law. He checked the ledger aloud and quoted prisoners on his fingers. The chronicle of certain mannerisms function as both managerial theatre and moral buffering. By performing ritual, the warden placed each transfer inside the frame of civic necessity. The ledger showed neither enthusiasm nor regret, only the steady application of municipal force. Testimonies of guards recall Albert's voice. Precise, devoid of inflection, as to each syllable were another entry to be made. When questioned by a municipal inspector, the ledger records a terse notation. Inspectors visit me 30.41, answered Norris's noted. The ledger's silence is itself practice. Yet the system brittle at points. The chronicler's work reveals fissures. A clerk who refused to make an erasure and was transferred the ledger notes Johan moved to utter work. Resignation. 4.462. A mason who left a tool in a shaft and later reported a missing man. The old scrap of paper tucked into a margin that reads like an apology. These anomalies provided the chronicle with raw materials to reconstruct sequences the ledger sought to obscure. From the margins came traces. A smudge of soot that matched a rope star. A fingerprint in the gutter close to the bending. A note indicating a rope purchase on the same day as a detention. The architectural concealment relied on uniform compliance. Where that compliance cracked, evidence could be assembled. A ledger line with shaky strokes reads, hook replaces found in shaft Smith Hay Weiss incident. See margin note. The margin note almost erased reads, is it not look up, forgive. Two small human marks contradict the ledger's mechanical will. The city itself was complicit in habit indifference. Market sellers who smelled damp air near the municipal hall learned to cross the street when the night smell hit. One vendor's testimony offers procedural detail. The smell arrived most often after storms, when drain ran slow and the pit's vents exhaled. Children invented games that imitated echoing voices. Adults turned conversation away from the clatter in the drains. Silence has its own municipal economics. To speak is to risk instability. The ledger's removal of name made disappearance practical because it treated memory. A missing man becomes an unremarked absence if no one insists on accounting for him. The nameless prisoner, a single scrap of paper, a torn letter folded into a fist, becomes an emblem of resistance. Some survivors kept these folded scraps under their clothing as talismans, as proof they had been somebody once. The ledger catalogs things that can be counted. It cannot count the way a mother looks for the space beside her at the table and finds it empty. Investigations that attempted to expose the pit found themselves thwarted by legal barrier and the limits of municipal jurisdiction. The Troneler cataloged official responses to inquiries, deflection, appeals to order, thinly veiled threats of disruption. The city claimed that openness would invite chaos. Letters from outside magistrates are annotated in the ledger with court replies. Jurisdiction improper. Refer to local courts. When an external delegation requested to inspect the undercroft, the ledger records visits scheduled, delineate rational, public safety. The warden's ledger entries provide the apparatus for those refusals. By centralizing decisions about bodies, the municipality maintained a kind of hygienic peace. The chronicler's conclusion is stark. When institutions decide what life is legible, they also decide what life may be erased without consequence. Yet the ledger cannot erase everything. It preserves the arithmetic of disappearance, and the human residue bureaucracies overlook. The chronicler's interest in texture, the scent of damp stone, the grain of rope, the tremor in a prisoner's breath, is deliberate. To textures their testimony to what systematic records can note, the life experience of procedure and the way bodies respond to institutional design. The nameless prisoner who survived the shaft's periphery took with him not numbers, but sensations. He remembers the burn of that row on his palm, the way candle wax hardened in the corners of the cell, and the echoing cadence of his own name called once and then never again. He kept in his memory the sound of Albrecht's counting, a metronome of erasure. The ledger and the warden are entwined instruments. Together they convert law into erasure, counting into forgetting. The chronicler's pages insist is not an aberration but a modality, governance that uses silence as enforcement. The dossier in these pages catalogues not only the machinery of disappearance but how ordinary municipal activity was reversed to that end, purchase orders, maintenance logs, though distributions recorded addressing to entries indicating pit transit. Those addresses evidence the ethwick mundane tasks can be made complicit. The chapter closes lingered in image. The ledger clasped shut under a lamp spool, its skin of leather marked by the thumbprints of many hands. Warden Albrecht saw a silhouette in the doorway, counting visible men in a ritual practice so frequently it has become mechanical. Singleton scrap of letter folded into a fist and pressed to a shriver's chest. These are not mere metaphors but archival facts the chronicler preserves with a flourish, because the point of preservation is the unflinching witnessing of mechanism. Systems that make disappearance practicable also make it perpetual. The record remains in raw fibers, a smudge in a margin. The chronicler preserves these traces as a caution that the instruments of governance, ledgers, uniform, maintenance rosters can be turned into what erasure, and when they are, their bureaucratic language will be the most effective camouflage. The municipal ledger does not weep, it does not pause for breath. Its pages are measured in depth, in economical structure of a clerk determined to convert human names into entry numbers and obligations. The ledger is the instrument by which the Hole of Nuremberg was made ordinary. This chapter documents the ledgered machinery and the descent that followed it. The procedural steps, the men who signed the pages, the chain of custody for a body without dignity, and the architecture of silence that turned a vertical shaft under the cobbles into municipal policy. The chronicler record with deliberate distance, names when necessary, numbers where convenient, gestures otherwise. The aim is not to inflame but to record the manner in which an administrative apparatus reframed murder as maintenance. Nuremberg's mythical astral contains fragments of this adaptation. There are accounts of repairs to the jail, lists of expenditures for rope and oil, notations of removal and interment with little to link them to flesh or suffering. There are minutes from council meetings that note measures to preserve public order and health return that record disposal in clinical language. The ledger is lexicon and alibi. Tasked with enforcing order, clerks, warden, use the ledger to translate social anxiety into actionable bureaucracy. A suspicion became an arrest warrant, an arrest became a notation became a line item. The line item authorized a descent. Warren Brecht's handwriting is not ornamental. It presumes authority and accepts costs. Where the clerk's hand is thin and efficient, Brecht's ledger entries are heavy, punctuated, as if blood restrains an impulse to explain. The municipal folios and the warden's private book alternate in tone, the one institutional, blank and legal, the other intimate, crumpled, annotated. In Brecht's pocketbook, kept separate from the public rolls, marginalia accumulate, ties, names, brief justifications, shorthand for repeated events. These personal notes reveal a pattern more than a motive. They show a man methodical in the maintenance of fear. A man who measures the city's malaise not only in coin but in the weight of rope and the number of days between transfers. The procedure begins with an accusation, often small, a debt dispute, a tavern quarrel, an unlicensed sermon. In a city of cobbled streets and wooden scenes, cheap offenses could mutate into civic terror. Curfew infractions and alleyway brawl were recorded, and if a name recurred, the ledger advanced it from suspicion to detention. The watchman delivered prisoners to the jail's outer holding cell. They waited beneath dim lanterns while clerks transcribed their names in both official and irrevocable. An intact entry might read, Johannes A. Vagrancy, Lodgebirds A. after Michaelmas, bonds fixed. The wording is almost pedantic, and yet the consequent implicit in it is final. A second ledger, kept only by the warden and his closest, lists transfers. Transfers are administrative euphemism for the movement of bodies from surface custody to subterranean custody. Transfers often accompanied by small expenses. Additional rope, wax valence, sharpened spike for securing pulleys. Item is rationalized. Rope to secure a detainee refusing swing, wax to light a long descent, spike for a harness that must hold weight. Their coating recast instruments of degradation and infrastructure. An entry might read, matter-of-factly, transfer, mode mail, breach of order, rope, sulfatums. Capstan or sundries, the terseness itself a technique of erasure. The pit itself is a chapter of engineering. An well shaft, bored deeper and winded in secret, is sat beneath the municipal jail. Accessible by a trapdoor in the cellar and by a narrow hatch under a paving stone in the back courtyard. The shaft's lip was reinforced with iron banding. A rudimentary pulley and capstan were installed in the warden's office above. The ledger records an order. Iron banding baels, capstan repair mozay labor, rope fatums. The numbers are prosaic, the reality is mechanical and final. The shaft's plan is hinted at in maintenance vouchers and mason S bills. Spent high days dressing stone. Rebate code for iron collar, lime and pitch for seams. Each aim describes a piece of civilian labor that, when assembled, becomes a mechanism for disappearance. The descent into the hole was formalized. Procedures were written and rehearsed like a liturgy of suppression. A prisoner transferred for breach of order was shackled, led to the cellar where the lantern threw long, patent shadows, and readied at the trap. A pair of warders steadied the rope while the warden inspected the binding and tan. With the same methodical motion employed for official signatures, authorized the lowering. The watchman at the exterior gate noted the time. The clerk crossed out the name in the docket and annotated a terse phrase, taken to void, that served as both explanation and erasure. A transfer order could be checked against the daybook. 4:25 PM, transfer executed. Witnesses, Schmidt watchman, pay Len's clerk. The witnesses, in most cases, were those obliged by duty. The presence attested less as to legally than to the appearance of procedure. Witnesses were minimal by design. Few municipal staffers were recorded as present during a transfer. Few were still direct to look into the shaft. Silence, often a practical choice in a wet court cellar, became a policy enforced by intimidation. The ledger and its compact vocabulary allowed the city to maintain plausible deniability, the entry of removal without the entry of costs, the replacement of a human name by an administrative tag. When questions were asked by relatives, parish clerics, or an occasional magistrate, the response was procedural. Records show removal on the grounds of public health or corrective custody. There are letters in the archive that petition for information and receive in reply certified copy of entries that provide no human detail. The bureaucracy offered a document as consolation and nothing else. The nameless prisoner is the archetype in this account. Not a single body but a composite of the money was slid from ledger to whole. In a city where names could be mistaken and memory fragile, the nameless became the way in which the municipal machine measured itself. Those who survive encounters with lip of the pit describe a disorientation, a perception of verticality that erased context, a place where every sound bent back upon itself and returned as rumor. Survivors' testimony terse and exhausted with distance. One fragmentary account, given by a woman who had once worked in the jail kitchen and who later fled the city in shame and fear, recalls a drop and then no ski, and the sensation of being counted out of the world. Such phrases are not dramatic inventions, but the only language available to those who experience an ending defined by its absence of faces. From the cellar the shafts swallow with light. Lanterns guttered. The warden's iron keys chimed with a sound that was by turns ceremonial and ordinary. The police system run it under weight and time. At the lip, a brief inspection. The warden would check the stitching on bindings, feel the rope's fibers if verifying paper. He counted not prayers but increments of time. Minutes that divided the act into sections the ledger could record. The watchman counted hours for the docket. The clerk logged the figure. The city made murder into a set of timestamps. A transfer might be annotated with intervals. Lowered at 16:45. Clearance check at 17:05. Descent complete 17:10. The exactitude of timekeeping is strikingly ordinary, as if the disappearance required the same punctuation as the opening and closing of market stalls. Sound is vital in the reports that reach us. The echo from the shaft is the most consistent feature across survivor fragments. The hollow note carries, refracts, and persists. It makes the shaft a wit that refuses to be censored. One former watchman, retired and anonymous, testified that the sound of a man's return down the hole persisted, like a trailing thread in his memory. An oral artifact had returned in the clatter of rain or in the sudden boom of a falling iron pivot. You could hear how the bricks swallowed the voice he said in a statement recorded late in life. The ledger does not record sound. It records the cost of candles to better hear it. Receipts for tallow and wicks sit beside entries for rope, as if to show that illumination was a procurement needed to accomplish the transfer. An expense not of mercy but of effectiveness. Practical considerations governed the life cycle of a descent. The cities need to avoid disease, an ever-present concern, provided the official pretext for the pit's maintenance. Bodies were removed quickly, the ledger claims, to prevent contamination, yet removal meant secrecy rather than sanitation. Burials wrapped in municipal cloth and lowered into unmarked graves, or left within the shaft's side galleries, were catalogued as sanitary disposals. The romantic language of public health translated with chilling efficiency into methods that obscured identity. A dossier labeled health measures. Winter quarter will show a spike in entries for disposal during epidemics and winters when the city's patience for the poor and the restless grew thinner. The chronicler finds repetition across the ledger's pages. Names crossed out, fees levied against estates, notations of debt cancelled that, when cross-referenced with parish records of missing men and women. Allied with lists of those taken to the hole. In some cases, estates were charged for shows. In others, the cost of transport was debited against the prisoner's immigrant possessions, accounting served to ends. It kept the municipal budget tidy and it left a paper trail that suggested necessity rather than malice. An entry might indicate, almost solicitously, sure provided, charge to estate, Terry maintaining a veneer of care even, as it closed a ledger window over a life. A Brecht's managerial posture as in entries that record the upkeep of the pit as if it were a furnace, capstan oiled, rope replaced bottoms, lime for walls, rod for measuring depth repaired. Language to maintain efficacy becomes language that normalizes outcomes. The whole did not need to be secret from the watchful eye of the city. It simply needed a vocabulary that made it defensible under civic scrutiny. The ledger provided that vocabulary. It allowed the city to fold atrocity into housekeeping. The repetition of verbs, maintain, repair, replace, turns the apparatus into an ordinary municipal concern requiring budgets, oversight, and weekly rounds. There were, of course, accidents and complications. A rope frayed under tension, a capstan failed to turn, a prisoner descended, and the harness slipped. On rare occasions, the descent failed to be final. A rock lodged in a side chamber, a prisoner surviving long enough to be hoisted up again, alive enough to testify. His irregularities were anathema to the leisure order. They forced the warden to improvise. Extra hands called to silence a survivor. A private ledger notation instructing the clerk to alter an entry. An outside healer bribed to remove signs of violence. Even when the physical evidence survived, systematic editing records could still undermine testimony. One case shows a hurried addition. Note: corrections referred instead to infirmary. Later interment recorded. That correction, when cross-checked against parish absence lists, suggests a different, darker chronology. Municipal complicity extended beyond the jail's walls. Local merchants sold cottage and iron in plain daylight. Masons and carpenters did the covert labor reinforcing the shaft. The ledger contains their invoices, their endorsements. A craftsman's signature on a bill for iron band enters him in complicity. Tradesmen were paid in coin and in discretion. Their hands built the shaft. Their mark in the ledger made the construction legitimate. A smith's petty receipt for iron rim and rivets sits among more flagrant items, reflecting how ordinary commerce can become a support structure for extraordinary violence. Resistance existed but rarely as open rebellion. More often it took the form of small refusals. A clerk who refused to cross a name out without a cause. A watchman who muttered a caution into the margins of his journal. Such marginalia sometimes survive and provide the only dissenting voice within the municipal paper trail. These notes are brief, occasionally bitter. A margin that reads too easy beside a ledger entry is a small eruption of conscience. Another clerk inserted a notation, no witness present, that later proved incendiary when a curious magistrate followed the line. But the ledger's momentum was weightier than one small mark, institutional habit to cover over confrontation. The chronicling of these procedures is not an exercise in vengeance, it is a catalogue. The chronicler's duty is to show the mechanics by which the Hole of Nuremberg ceased to be an anomaly and became a municipal instrument. By tracing the ledger entries, the personal notes of wardens, the receipts of craftsmen, and the disparate survivor accounts, a pattern emerges. An entire civic structure that rationalized the removal of bodies and the erasure of names. The pattern is not a conspiracy so much as a synergy of routine. Many small official actions combining into a single, terrible function. The whole, by design, renders 10 forms of testimony impossible. Its geometry prevented clear sightlines. Its acoustic fractures statements into fragments. Its death-made record-keeping a separate clerical act divorced from the body itself. The city preferred the language of disappearance and transfer. Disappearance implies loss, transfer implies process. The ledger chose to use both. Thus, when a relative demanded a burial place, the response could be both untruthful and plausible. Interment recorded, unknown location. The ambiguity suited the municipal mind, for it kept compassion at arm's length while preserving administrative form. What remains are artifacts? A length of rope with a manufacturer's tag, a municipal receipt for lime to cell walls, a penitential note added to an inhes. These items, when assembled, form more than evidence. They form an index of practice. They show how public administration can be engineered to render human abstraction ordinary. Items catalogued for one purpose become tools of another. Documents that should illuminate life become instruments of erasure. The final pages of the municipal folio record with a certain bureaucratic fatigue, a moment when civic rhetoric faltered. An outbreak of public mourning, sparked by a single surviving witness, spoke of with an accent that gave his words the power of foreignness, forced inquiries. A scandalizing rumor reached the ears of a magistrate who had not previously been compelled to pray beneath the cobbles. An external auditor requested copies. For a brief season, the ledgers as it became a malleability rather than a defense. Entries were cross-checked, receipts were summoned. The warden's pocketbook became a central object of interest. But the ledger is resilient. Paper can be burned. Ink can be blurred by water. Signatures can be claimed to be forgeries. The municipal apparatus practiced at rationalization, shifted language and venue. Transfer of bodies were increasingly recorded as salvage operations after a storm, as burials of unknowns in the wake of an epidemic. The hall did not vanish. It was recast when inquiry threatened it. Administrative vocabulary proved adaptable. The city discovered that language could be as effective a shield as stone. Even as official scrutiny increased, the auditory memory of the shaft remained. Men remembered an echo like a seam in the air. Those who had watched the trapdoor should heard a silence that reverberated differently from ordinary absence. The chronicler knows because sound, unlike signatures and accounts, does not bend easily to intent. It persists, it refuses to be fully achieved into neat lies. Returns, sometime years later, in the mind of a watchman as the memory of a voice lost to verticality. Memory and echo form a counter-record where pair will not. The ledger's final lesson is procedural. Atrocity becomes sustainable when it is embedded in routine and language. The Hole of Nuremberg functioned not because every actor was monstrous, but because many actors accepted small duties that, when combined, achieve a single terrible end. The ledger taught them how to be efficient. The city learned to be indifferent. The smaller moral compromises, the acceptance of TD entries, the willingness to sign a receipt without inquiry, accumulated into institutional practice. The chronicler records these facts without flourish. Honesty here is procedural. The ledger does not need to be dramatized to be horrifying. To read its entries is to observe the slow, administrative manufacture of disappearance. The hall remained for years a subject of rumor, of occasional inquiry, and of persistent memory. Even when the shaft was filled and the trapdoor blocked, the echoes, physical and archival, endured. Centuries trace over stone and ink, but the ledger's templates persist in other places. In lists of removed refugees, in bureaucracy that hide inconvenient lives behind asterisks and footnotes. This chapter seeks not only to document Nuremberg's speed, but to make visible the process by which the civic instruments can be repurposed into tools of erasure. If the city experiences power and excess in preservation, the ledger at its keepers instead how to preserve secrecy. The final argument is simple and cold. To name a process is to challenge it. The ledger renamed bodies as entries. The chronicler renames the ledger as instrument. This inversion is the only corrective the paper permits. It is the method by which memory resists accounting. What really happened beneath the cobbles of Nuremberg was far worse than the official ledger allowed. This chapter gathers municipal records, the ink-smudged margin notes of a warden who spoke it on our priest, and the fractured testimony left on scraps in a gone hand, and arranges them against a wider frame. The civic appetite for order, the transformation of punishment from public spectacle to sequestration, and the slow accretion of method had turned in a municipal hall into a mechanism of erasure. The aim is not to titillate but to fit an honest apparatus into language. The pit, the man who kept it, the ledgered economy that fed it, and then the remains of names written, if they written at all, only as codes in damp stone. The Hole of Nuremberg began, in bureaucratic terms, as an answer to a practical problem. In a quarter packet with cobblers, potters, and the small workshops that stitch the city's life together, an exhausted quarry seemed left a deep scar beneath a row of houses. To an architect charged with conserving urban fabric, and to a city council wary of repair costs, the fissure was an opportunity rather than simply a hazard. Stone can for roadways, and for the raising of new facades, left a vertical moat where once there had been only a slope. Early entries in the municipal account book note payments for planking and a hatch, the sort of hurried, pragmatic repairs that convert a fissure into a hoarded place. From convenience came from secrecy a deliberate, routinized process. At first, the shaft served as a place to store foods, old timbers, and the broken wares of a neighborhood. Then became useful for things the council did not want to see again. The bodies of those removal solved civic problems without creating questions. A rope and winch originally used for hauling stone was repurposed. Planks and a simple hut, adequate for a quarry, now masked descent into a different function. Over seasons, the ordinances that governed its usage grew specific, then technical, then ritualized. What began as pragmatic adaptation hardened into institutional practice. Nuremberg city assisted at a nexus of commerce and adjudication. Bearers required visible order, procession stops, public beating, when those spectacles served as a civic admonition. But there were classes of transgression and classes of persons for whom spectacle had undesirable complications. The merchant who mismanaged wares but had influential kin. The artisan whose pick threatened a guild's equilibrium. The political troublemaker whose public execution might inspire martyrdom. These were not problems in which the council wished to invite a crowd. Thus the whole evolved into a binary solution. A place where the body might be disposed of under municipal authority, where shame might be contained, and where the city could claim it had neither sanctioned cruelty nor permitted a public disorder. Plausible deniability became an administrative virtue. The ledger is a stubborn artifact that anchors most echoes. It is bureaucratic in tongue and economy. Names, dates of arrest, and a small, oblique column stamped with the warden's initials. The handwriting is compact, cramped, as if written standing by lamplight with cold fingers. Some pages have been hastily stitched back, others bear water damaged, and a ring of red rust from a chain that once lay across them. The ledger treats human loss as math. Rows of names are dismissed with shortened and inked symbols that correspond to the shaft. When the chronicler first encountered it, he described an economy of erasure. A table where subtraction is performed in margins, where a struck to name is both an administrative act and an act of disappearance. Warden Albrecht ran his off like a clerk of inevitability. He quoted with ritualized gestures, fingers mapping inventory like a man who performed prayer with the ledger. Formal in his carriage, unmiling, he wrapped municipal necessity in the language maintenance. To him the whole was primarily an infrastructural problem. Who to sing, when to seal, how to ration rumor. Among his possessions, after death the chronicler catalogued a separate booklet, bronze and oiled, its page annotated in a narrow, mechanical hand. The notes read less like orders and more like an engineer's mind-mapping tolerances. Rope strength and wear, frequency of descent, the rate at which a cree abated in damp air, and the specific measurements of the shaft itself. The booklet contains tables, measurements of rope at even lots, the estimated time until a loop sagged to a certain degree. Instructions for wedging minor protrusion from the walls. These are not interpolations of legend. The booklet was inventoried as a municipal effect, taken down alongside keys and seals. Operationalizing cruelty concentrates in procedure. Prisoners were registered in the outer gaol and processed before clerks with small, repetitive bureaucracy. Arrests followed forms name alleged offense fine set whether family had been notified. The nameless prisoner, here a composite voice assembled from multiple surviving scraps of testimony, describes the motion from the common cell to the lower hatch as a sequence of small, deliberate humiliations. Hands were bound, belts stripped, hair sheared in a mechanical gesture that removed identity as surely as a number applied in charcoal. The corridor smelled of damp linen, of spilled alley, of the iron tang of fear. Prisoners were brought to a stone slab where the warden read from the docket, fingers braced on the page, a candle between them casting faces in hard relief. There was no religious last office. The warden's clipped voice assigned a fate while a clerk reads a tax code. The ritual had civic language about it and no absolution. The descents engineered for finality. A rope with a leather loop was fixed to a wick and lowered through a hat into a vertical shaft, while a handful of attendants ensured no public spectacle would gather at the street above. The pit's geometry is described with the kind of detail that marks industrial documents. Variable wall angles, slick strata of moisture, irregular outcrop that guaranteed injury on contact, and a flow invisible to a hatch-lit eye. The shaft did not function as a site for a single, decisive act, but rather as a chamber for delayed death. Bodies were lowered, sometimes placed on small ledges, sometimes left to hang from jutting stones. Their weight gradually sagged ropes, whereupon staff below might nudge them further into the black or allow time to do its work. The architecture produced an elongation of suffering that made cries extend beyond the moment of descent. The slow calendar of pain was itself part of punishment. Sun operates as another sort of ledger in that place. Nuremberg's cobbles and alleys carry and move south in different ways. A public execution sends noise across the square and into the stalls, where the pit muffles and elongates. The ropes are scraped, the damp stones echo, the small rustle of a scrap of cloth falling. These sounds accrue into a long subterranean resonance. The chronicler measured acoustics, frequency of a cries wrought by half after a certain depth. Long ones persisted in a slow register that was audible through hours rather than minutes. After several hours, only metallic gurgling remained. This empirical detail render horror administrable. Once sound can be mapped and timed, concealment can be scheduled with a precision that neutralizes public alarm. Methodical cruelty thrives where accountability is absent. The city's public census and council minutes can enumerate citizens, but those who were incarcerated were often anonymous in daily life. Records were distributed across clerks and tucked into private pouches. The warden stamp and a chain of minor attestations served as final authority. Margins of the ledger hold notes, initials of artisans, small accounts of payment to men who hauled away refuse. Evidence of a peripheral economy that made the pits function a municipal secret. Quarrymen were paid for discreet cutting horse. Cobblers' apprentices received coin for repair work done at odd times. A baker's boy was commanded to remove soiled straw. Bribes were not grand, they were systematic and quotidian, the crazy mechanisms that keep a machine turning. Those who survived the pit, if they return at all, carry anatomized memories that could scarcely be unified into a narrative. The nameless prisoner, a voice aggregated from written references, speaks in sensory fragments. The smell of mud eaten by saltpeter, the taste of iron on the tongue, the sensation of fingers slipping along rope fibers as the wool dipped into a vertical blackness. Memory of the descent alternates with a catalogue of humiliation. Being stripped to a threadbare tunic and marked with a charcoal number on the shoulder. Being forced to run the palm over the coarse weave of the rope to confirm its roughness. Being told to listen to the city above and quote days like a litany. Litanies were partial depositions. A hand pressed to a ledger in the middle of a sentence. A half subwritten in shaky script, a smudge where tears stained paper. For the chronicler's testimony is valuable precisely because it supplies human texture to a ledger that otherwise speaks only in ink. Yet those voices are always palimpsests, scraps overwritten, urgent and half-erased, the coherence attenuated by trauma. The social calculus had permitted the pit matters as much the physical mechanics. Municipal leaders rationalized the whole as an instrument of quiet justice. It removed destructive bodies without the contagion of spectacle. Markets could operate without the odor of burned flesh or the sight of a carcass at a stall. Guildmasters preferred fine disappearances that dissolved trouble without arousing public sympathy. In times of unrest, disappearing opponents in the pit prevented martyrdom. The absence of a body be perversely more useful to the authorities than a public execution, because it forested the meat-making that accompanies sacrifice. No shrine can be built to a name that is crossed out and sealed into damp timber and stone. There were limits to this apparatus. Rumor is a corrosive agent in any secret system. Families began to suspect when sons, spouses, and fathers failed to come home. A mother seeking news might be met at the ward with an entry that stopped midline. A sister could be offered a municipal fee in exchange for silence. The chronicler observed that concealment requires acts of assassiness, meager payments, the occasional false promise of release, the ritual of an official looking regretful while declining to offer details, suggests lubricant the machina removal. They are part of what allows the civic body to continue functioning while a subterranean infrastructure it tows the city no longer needs. Ritualized trappings normalize certain actions. Warden Albrecht's habit of wearing ceremonial gloves when issuing orders, the chronicler knows, is symbolic calibration. Glove letter hatch, the motion becomes administration rather than barbarism. His heavy iron ring and short dagger were less tools than signifiers. They lend formality to his movements. Tasuk Chiming's matter cannot be overstated. Brutality hides behind form just as often behind secrecy. The addition of a register, a temptable, or a formula converts an atrocity into a municipal practice carried out according to rules. The men who carry out descent became technicians rather than executioners. The apparatus required them to obey. There were attempts at resistance, small, desperate, episodic. Smuggler coin bought moments of softness. A cobbler's apprentice once tried to wedge a length of iron under the hack to prevent it closing. A woman offered bread and an oath in exchange for the last glance at brother, and was told the procedure could not be altered. Once a daring boy lowered a lantern into the pit and found only a ragged scrap of clothing and a slow drip of water. These acts of compassion were swallowed by the apparatus, which favored routine over sporadic empathy. The chronicler records such attempts in marginal notes, names deaths, small indignities rewarded with silence. Even when acts of rescue occurred, they were insufficient against the design of concealment. Aftermath and memory are complicated. Later generation walked the couples with bright morning and no visible sign of the shaft. The whole remained a story told in hushed tones, then in the margins of household gossip, and then only in the private notebooks of those who kept municipal secrets long after the pit itself ceased operation. Yet traces remained. Stone that stayed too wet for the season, a ring of darker cobble on a misty morning, a single discarded shore beside a seam of mortar. Those relics perform a different work than bones. They are symbolic echoes that insist on the presence of an absence. Where the body once was, memory leaves a footprint in another register, an old house with a patched floorboard, a family that no longer attends certain markets, a name that ceases to be spoken at the table. For the chronicler, the duty is both forensic and moral. He passes ledger structures like a prosector parsing tissue, seeking patterns where the city sought to maintain known. His writing deliberately reduces emotive rhetoric to the point of clarity, so the mechanisms themselves stand exposed. To name the method, the rope, the hatch, the ledger's ink is an act of reparation. Naming dismantles the civic anonymity the whole was meant to impose. He charts intervals, tabulates time, record payments, and records the ritualized gestures of those who ran the machine. He refuses sentimental closure. His is an archival duty rather than a pastoral one. His hope is not salvation, but that the act of recording will tilt the municipal balance, even infinitesimally away from erasure. The Hole of Nuremberg teaches a grim lesson about civic cruelty. Cruelty flourishes where process replaces conscience. When institutional language persons in docketed items, when secret economies compensate a few who labor at concealment, and when ritual replaces responsibility, a municipal system can convert punishment into literal disappearance. The chronicler favors a final image that is not gory but precise. A single name crossed out in a ledger, the ink bled by damp, a small smear like a shadow that refuses to be accounted for. That smear is the trace of a life the city decided it no longer needed. Horrors are somewhat loud and bloody, but history also possesses quieter instruments of disappearance. The Hole of Nuremberg was neither the invention of a single monster nor the product of sudden madness. It was the logical endpoint of practices that valorized order and economy over the presence of persons. The chronicler's book closes with a list of names and a damp prayer that memory might outlast the ledger. He offers no consolation. His duty is archival, not pastoral. He hopes only that the act of recording offers a small tilt, a correction away from erasure. The couples still remember, in the way stone remembers the squeeze of a hill and the slow erosion of water. The city, bright in its marketplaces and austere in its council halls, carries the silent geometry of the pit in its gutters and in the muttered phrases of old men in taverns. The whole remains a lesson in how quiet cruelty can be normalized and how the simplest apparatus, rope, hatch, ledger, can perform the double work of removing bodies and erasing memory. For those who would follow the chronicler's work, there are more ledgers and more shafts to be read. Further, these were frightened and condemned were quietly catalogued and closed away. If you wish to continue these leisurely excavations into the places where life was subtracted in civic margins, the chronicler's entries remain open for those who will read and remember. The municipal records of Nuremberg carry a silence was never simple. The silence is ledgered, inked, numbered. It is the liberace of official procedure and the mechanical cadence of obligations met and bodies disposed. In the middle of the 15th century, beneath the cobbles of one narrow square of the city, a municipal prison kept a secret that was designed to be shoutless by design yet paradoxically measured by sound. The hours that the pit swallowed, the screams that echoed for race, and the votes of magistrates that ratified disappearance as governance. This chapter is a methodical survey of that mechanism. It's written from a point of observation, a chronicle assembled from municipal letters, fragmentary testimony, and careful inspection of the site itself. The aim is not to sensationalize, but to document, to record how a community engineered justice to become a system of forgetting. The narrative follows three figures' presences are constant in all surviving sources. The chronicler, who kept notes and inspected the municipal papers. Warden Albrecht, the administrator who maintained custody and enforced the pit's function. And the nameless prisoner, a composite voice drawn from the few surviving, battered testimonies that reach ears outside the prison walls. By holding to these fixed presences, the record preserves a stable anatomy of the pit's operation and its moral architecture. From above, the prison presented the ordinary municipal face that made secrecy practicable, a wooden trapdoor set flush with stone, a short flight of steps leading to a low-arched gate, a corridor of damp cells lit by narrow slits, and the passing of torches. Citizens saw only the small courtyard and room of men in service uniforms who answered to no particular sit inside. Below, the architecture was deliberate. A vertical shaft bored through earth and mortar, descending by a ladder ridge, opening into a damp dark that swallowed light and redirected sound. The shaft terminated in a chamber whose geometry exaggerated silence. Slopestone and water basins caught sound and released as long, resonant drips. Niches and hedges of mortar fractured tones into many small, indistinguishable threads. The effect was an acoustic sync. Once a voice entered the pit, the geometry of the place folded that voice into a slow, diminishing vibration that lingered, felt like a presence, but yielded no information. To the overseers, this was mercy made municipal. To those who governed by leisure, it was a toll. Records maintain that the pit performed several municipal functions at once. Formerly, it served as the endpoint for sentences executed outside the public square. Persons sentenced to disappear for crime and transgressions of municipal codes were taken there under the rubric administrative removal. Informally, it functioned as a repository for problems the city wished to excise without spectacle, social embarrassments, inconvenient wrongdoers whose public punishment might produce unrest, and persons whose continued existence threatened influential households. The pit offered security without the bureaucracy of burial rites, the legal attention of public trials, or the ritual complexity of ecclesiastical disposal. Warden Albrecht administered these provisions with procedural rigor. He kept the ledger and kept the keys. His hand appears in municipal entry analytics and measure annotations, detached names, the shorthand of custody and transfer. He performed the ritualized steps with ceremonial formality that rendered disposal into municipal ordinance. He would check the ledger, count on his fingers, and mark entries with deliberate strokes. The removal was as much performance as execution, an act that conferred the authority of office to the discipline of ritualized paperwork. The record describes, with a precision that borders on the liturgical, the sequence, the sealing of a pouch, the impression of a municipal ring upon it, the stamping of a docket, the reading aloud of a code number, although in the presence of witnesses whose roles were registered and 10 FSs. The chroniclers arranged these elements in a different register. He attended to texture. The oil stains on ledger pouches, the size of nail heads on trapdoors, the color of rust on rings. His interest is empirical, and his voice is clinical. But he also records the affective residue left by the pit. The way guards removed gloves before they gestured toward the shaft, the habitual tilt of the warden's head when he inspected a name, the way prisoners folded letters small and kept them light talismans. The chronicler's notes reveal how municipal procedure was rationalized into a language that made disappearance ordinary. The pit was simply an administrative instrument, as expected as a docket or a seal. He catalogued what could be catalogued and, by doing so, insisted that the uncatalogued sound, the folded paper, the damp-rinsed stone remain legible as evidence. The nameless prisoner stands as the human index within these systems. He is composite, a shorthand for the faces and testimonies that survived long enough to be recorded, and his presence permits an account of experience rather than merely of process. He is described in the records as gaunt, bruised, and marked by the narrow iron shackle on his ankle. He speaks through fragments, and in the half-memory of Hoyto later told his story to the chronicler. He is important precisely because he reveals what official language excised: interiority. Where municipal records produce numbers, the prisoner traces produce resistance. He folds a torn scrap of a letter into his fist. He stares at the floor. He dreams of the ski beyond the cobbles. Mechanically, the pit's procedure is cold and efficient. Arrest occurs in daylight or close to it. The charge is recorded. The prisoner is catalogued and held in a cell. The warden notes the date and the expected disposition. On prearranged days, a market week morning, and while before the merchants set up, selected prisoners are escorted beneath the cobbles. There is no public ceremony, no proclamation. The trapdoor is opened. The prisoner is borne. A rope and harness are exchanged. The descent is performed quickly and with repetition. The geometry of the pit means that the initial moments of descent produce the most audible output. A braided hall of breath and panic that falls against stone and water into stretched echoes. Those echoes linger in the nearby masonry for hours. The neighboring alleyways retain a thin, metallic after-sound that the chronicler measured at intervals and noted with his habitual, uninflected attention. Accounts of the pit's acoustic character are repeatedly precise. Cries fracture into long decays. Intervals of silence are interrupted by distant, diffuse splashes, and a last vibrational thread of human presence remains felt more than understood. The chronicler documented the ways in which the pit's architecture ensured that sound remained evocative but not informative, loud enough to be noticed, structured so that it answered no question and supplied no narrative. This physics of erasure produces the exact effect desired by Toy who administered it. The city could feel its conscience pricked by sound without having to answer questions about cause. The sound functioned as moral deterrent and civic anesthetic simultaneously. Enough cessation to dignify the absence, not enough detail to demand remedial action. Beyond the mechanical and the acoustic, the pit's assistants shape behavior. Warden Albrecht and his subordinates developed rituals of deniability. They kept letters in potas, marked by municipal seals. They staged transfers matters of record rather than of claim. Words were trained to remove personal effects and limit contact. The bureaucratic language used by magistrates reframed the pit as a communal hygiene, a necessary excision. This restored a moral environment in which the pit seemed not merely practical but inevitable. The function of governance, the rhetoric insisted, was to maintain order. The pit imposed a clarity to that claim. Disorder is solved by absence. Resistance appeared when it did in small, dangerous forms. A mother might come to the prison and demand sight of a body. Sometimes a brother would insist on a name, threatening to lay bare those who had seen the poachers. Occasionally a ledger entry would be questioned. A clerk remarked upon an anomaly and found himself resigned. Those impulses did not vanish. They were suppressed by the pressure of official procedure. Sometimes suppression took the form of paperwork, a missing line explained as mistranscription, a name crossed and replaced with a municipal code, a date shifted en hors to fit a docket. At other times suppression was performative. A guard would count runners, loud and close a cell door, allowing the sound of the locked doors or the rest. The ritual of counting served both to echo and to silence. In the moment it was ambiguous. The chronicler observed this clinically. He recorded the ticks of concealment, the place where records were folded and refolded. The cell was walled by fine handprints. He took measurements of the trapdoors, hinges, and the bolt marks on the subterranean wood. He described the damping of stones at the pit's mouth where moisture darkened the masonry. He catalogued ledger entries in parallel with what he could observe physically. A park listing a departure date beside a soberette, abandoned show in the square above. For him, the conjunction of the material and the texture was neither theatrical nor incidental. It was forensic. The shoe and the pouch were complementary evidence, one a vestige of life, the other the instrument of erasure. Prisoners' experiences in the day for descent reveal mechanisms of psychological degradation that were as deliberate as the architecture. Isolated in themselves, subjected to cold intermittent violence, prisoners often disintegrated into routines of memory and clutching. The scrap letter becomes a recurrent object across many testimonies, a fragment of an outside life folded into the palm, the last artifact of identity kept in the dark. The nameless prisoner gestures speak to this logic of retention. He folds the paper into his fist as if reinforcing a boundary between himself and the administration's machinery. He listens to the distant echo of the pit and registers both terror and a perverse hope that sound can carry meaning to a world above. He misnames days by the pattern of market bells he hears in the distance. He times hunger by the thump of footsteps over the trapdoor. His mind confers narrative upon fragmentary inputs, as though stitching a shroud of meaning from the smallest threads. Municipal actors use ritualized distancing to make the pit survivable for themselves. Warden Albrecht, who removed gloves before giving orders and carried ceremonial dagger as a symbol of authority rather than a practical instrument, performed separation. He distanced himself by ritual, armor, letter, and language. He would read aloud a name and then pronounce a municipal code, making the act legislative and thus impersonal. The chronicler kept distance by not passing explicit judgment in his notes, focusing instead on method and cataloging. Both figures are complicit, though in different ways. The warden sought to continue the procedure as a normalized instrument of governance. The chronicler sought, by precise description, to expose and preserve the traces of what the procedure accomplished. The pit also functioned as a municipal experiment in economy and governance. To contemporary municipal actors, this appearance was cheaper than trial. It was efficient in resource terms and politically less risky. It allowed magistrates to excise problems incrementally, to maintain social equilibrium without major disruption. Yet when efficiency becomes an ethic, public morals atrophy. The city's reluctant conscience expresses itself into forms: the ritual of ledger keeping, an attempt to maintain accountability, and the creation of acoustic ambiguity, a way of keeping moral sensation without necessitating action. These dual responses reveal how institutions attempt to maintain equal equilibrium while continuing practices that contradict ethical precepts. The ledger is both instrument and alibi. The echo is both witness and muffler. Occasional exposure tested the system. Whisper reached clergy and merchants. A monk recorded a rumor in a private missive. A traveling cloth merchant noted a missing apprentice in a margin. When scrutiny increased, practice adapted. Removal was done more quickly, records more tightly sealed. The timing staff shifted to less trafficked hours. The pit's administrators had learned that secrecy could be sustained by bureaucratic density. The more procedures there were, the less anyone dared to step to them and ask inconvenient questions. The cumulative effect was insidious. Over decades, the pit became embedded in civic life as an instrument that no one could fully mark with responsibility. The long-term effect on the city was corrosive. So trust eroded where disappearance was institutionalized. Families learned to measure their claims against municipal reluctance. Apprentices ceased to confide fully in masters. Household disputes were resolved with a newly wary prudence. The very idea was just to warp it into a set of solutions that prioritizes stability over truth. The chronicler, in his deliberate pauses and unchanging attention to detail, recorded his corrosion. His notebook is full of small notes. The date when a ledger puck was replaced, the time and arrest in relation to market hours, the smell of damp leather. These tiny observations, when aggregated, map an institution's moral decline. He also recorded the small countervailing impulses of compassion and revolt. A woman who demanded to see the face behind a municipal number was removed from waiting room and, according to a clerk's marginalia, spoken to gently and then sent away with bread. A good elder once asked the warden in public about record keeping. The warden replied with an inventory list and a demonstration of seals. These disturbances were answered not by correction but by reinforcement. More shield, more pouches, more ritual. The city's mechanisms learned to immunize themselves against pity. As the chapter closes, the scene shifts from the pit itself to the memory of the pit. The solitary show in the square, the damp ring on stone, the way the town's morning light catches a single drop scrap of paper. The chronicler closes his old-stained notebook. His observations are not a remedy, they are a record. He writes to preserve rather than to rescue. The warden continues his duty, counting names and closing doors. The nameless prisoner's letter remains folded and contained, a final act of resistance that resists annihilation by inscription. The pit story is not merely about a place, it is about how communities institutionalize forgotten. It is about the calculus that transforms absence into administration and about the techniques by which ethical visibility is replaced by procedural cleanliness. The pit was a municipal technology, efficient, sound architected, and morally corrosive. The technology required not only the lowered stone and the practiced rope, but the smaller instruments of habit, the seal pressed into wax, the glove removed before a gesture, the ledger entry that replaces a person with a coat. In the end, the sound of the pit is the last and most telling instrument. It produced a kind of civic memory, one that registered the fact of removal without ever articulating reason. The city could hear its conscience in a stretch of sound and then return to daily work, comforted by the knowledge that the mechanism of removal had functioned as expected. The chronicler's work is an attempt to translate it into a language that will not allow the city to forget what the pit did. The record insists that even when institutions desist to offer responsibility, traces remain. The leisure, the damp ring, the folded scrap of letter, offers as evidence that the city chose a particular kind of order and paid a moral cost that would long outlast its own ledgers. It is a document of method, not of sentiment. It is an attempt at forensic memory. It catalogs instruments and the habits and the quiet efficiencies that made the pit possible and, in doing so, asks the reader to consider how systems of governance can structure forgetting into daily duty. The pit did its work when it converted presence into absence. The chronicler's work resists that conversion by insisting that even administrative silence is a form of testimony. The combined trace asks a simple question. What do we call justice when it is measured in the sound of the dead and the neatness of a ledger? Some chapters in municipal history close with ceremony. This one closes with a detail. A page is turned, a word clicks in a pocket, and a note is filed away. The last vestiges of the pit's operation are not fireworks but the persistent, slackened echo that never quite stopped. Their screams faded, but the story rots. Yet in rotting it remained material. The chronicler at leisure will not resurrect those who will lower it into the pit. It will, however, preserve the fact of their being. Trash fragment and the stubborn evidence of absence inscribed by hand. The record is minimal, the handwriting measured. And because these traces endure, the city's silence is not total. The pit might have been designed to swallow sound, but it did not swallow the record of what it had done. The mootings remain audible to anyone willing to read the tally of seals and sure prints and to listen, with care, to the slackened echo that hangs over the square. The municipal ledgers of Nuremberg patent things, ink pressed into vellumenders in damp cellars when stone and timber forget the faces that passed over them. It is to these slow, careful records that the chronicler arrives at the pit, not as a single monstrous moment, but as a method logistical and ritualized. The pit of the sea prison is not introduced here as legend. It is catalogued. Each entry names a process: arrest, ingress, seal, ledger note, silence. That sequence is the anatomy of disappearance. This chapter assembled the detritus of the pit's routine. It traces, in ledger strokes and measured observation, how municipal order and a hunger for expediency braided into something that produces sound without answerer. Sound that been lasted in stone, the screams that the chronicler will later measure, and his own re-method, record. It is an account of systems and the human margins they reconfigure, where procedure hardens into permanence, and a city finds a cheaper answer to complexity. The pit sits below the cobbles, a city square, a vertical wound into bedrock and medieval pragmatism. Above, merchants tread and children run. Below, a shaft drops out of chitin. Its mouth masked wood, iron, and the complacency of officials. The shaft is not an accident. It is the product of measurements. Depth or mouth, shaft diameter to prevent a foothold, a rim lip to catch the light and the senses of those who bear and think themselves secure. It was conceived as a sound trap. It was made to be final. Warden Albrecht administers calculation with ceremonial calm. He is a man who comes in ledger marks and in the shape of his gloves. When he removed them to give orders, his duty presents itself as municipal necessity. Robbers, troublemakers. The city must move them out of sight for the stability of trade and the dignity of magistrates. He keeps his ledger in a leather strap, the corners of it pages tumbled to an almost regular angle. In his hand the list of causes rigged like a balance sheet. The cost of a man's liberty against the imagined cost of his continued presence in a common forum. But the veneer of civic order is thin over the pit as true commerce. Albrecht's pragmatism hardens into something else. In his ledger he records a column of reasons and a column of dispositions. The disposition often begins and ends with a sealed note. He has learned how to write the city's will as if it were a household chore, neat, necessary, quickest. The chronicler attends every procedure in the manner of a surgeon. He approaches the pit not to judge but to understand, not to inflame, but to render. He measures the pit's scream against the texture of the stone. He notes the cadence of the girl's footsteps and the way the rope bit into the wrists of those bound for descent. His apparatus is modest. An oil-stained notebook, an iron-bound lantern whose light messes off them, and a brass pocket watch with a face discolored by cellar smoke. He moves with deliberate pauses, instinct fasteners and leisure entries as if trying to reconstruct a method from its traces. There is discipline to his indifference, a coldness that is instrument rather than heartlessness, for the more precise his record the harder it is for the city to deny. Those traces link to the nameless prisoner, a composite of flesh and ledger ink. He is not a single life, but a type of being transformed by enforced absence. The prisoner's testimony, where it exists, is fractured. Where it does not, the scuff, a shaw, or a torn scrap of a letter provides a human punctuation. He arrives gone, with a scrap folded into his fist, and leaves the practice of living in the ledger as a data and a shorthand. The piece is the translation from Persian to code. The process begins with arrest. Street constables confiscate belongings, bind wrists, and mark the accused through the square where the cobbles mask the hole. Each step is an erasure ritual. Posture is reduced. I aver that passers-by are guided away with polite lies. Merchants pretend they wear no shame. Housewives took children by the sleeve and murmur about errands. The prisoner is catalogued by Warden Albrecht's ledger and then confined. The ledgers, sometimes smudged with salt from a guard's hand or the wet smear of rain, says the administrative tone. The finality is not extrajudicial but bureaucratic. At the chamber beneath the square the ritual accelerates. Guards open the cellar door and cough into the reek of wet stone. The chronicler will write later of this suffocation, the way voices fold into the pitch, how a candle's flame bends before it can illuminate the lips of those listening. Bodies are brought to the edge of the shaft, and the mechanics of descent across and practiced. A rope looped and worn has a habit of cutting leather where it rubs. Men on the rim hold it with calloused hands. One contracts the knot while another raises the ledger aloud, not to a quote but to the wood where the ledger's presence sanctifies the action. Technique matters. The rope is looped under arms, placed across shoulders, or sometimes bound at the waist. A shorted bundle will be linked to a stone if discretion is needed. The whole is measured to the way sound behaves within it. A measured scream indicates a particular depth and resonance. The pit staff learned to tune the action to acoustic properties. They found the combinations that produce it the most efficient silencing. For this distance to fracture the cry, a throat-strapping knot to spare protracted pleading, a dampening chamber coat from moss and sand to absorb plenty vividness. They kept a small chest with moss, burlap, and lime tucked in the cellar for this purpose. Exact ingredients and quantities are notated in Albrecht's hand. The piece cruelty is not random, it's engineered. Why does the city tolerate such engineering? The answer is a municipal history. Trade demanded predictability. Magistrates demanded a deterrent. And a populace exhausted by languor and hunger sought scapegoats. The pit offered a clean ledger entry and a trenchant public example. Word of mouth terror did the rest. It was cheaper and more effective to quell suspicion with absence and betrayal. The pit economized fear. It reduced the messy business of proof and testimony to a quick, administrable motion. A ledger entry erases argument as surely as the wood panel covers the shaft. The nameless prisoner provides the human counterweight to his administrative logics. In fragments he recalls stone and rope, the taste of iron, and a sense of being catalogued like a damaged ledger page. He does not always speak. His testimony is often a posture, a scrap letter folded into a fist, or the way his eyes will refuse the ceiling. When he does let memory break the bank of silence, he speaks in images. The good bell muffled by earth, the smell of lime and wet wool, the sensation of the rope's bite. These images are not narrative so much as sensory ledger entries. They persist because they are simple and because they mark the human cost the ledger erases. The chronicler's method is to quantify cruelty without moralizing. He draws charts of descent, maps the horrors between arrest and sealing, and cross-references names that recur like a cadence in the margins. He notes clinically the pattern of families who stop appearing in market registers after a set of disappearances and the threats that go quiet when certain men are taken. He tabulates the length of time between plane and removal, the frequency with which repeat founders are noted and then not noted. He draws little lines where a name ceases and a number begins. He records the ritual of those who remove themselves from sight and how municipal order repurposes grief as routine. This chapter also details the architects of concealment. Bayard Warden Abrecht Leisure stand the municipal council's complicity. Meetings held behind closed doors are described as conversations about stability. Tis the public language for what the pit accomplishes. Experience cloaked in pragmatism. The chronicler finds meanings that soften the pit's shape into policy. A motion to remove vagrants from the watchful eyes of commerce. A recorded vote to reduce disruptive elements through confinement. An annotated note about cost savings to the white when fewer names required accommodation. Where language abstracts, practices concretize. The pit translates municipal euphemism into administration of disappearance. Councillors sing their names to woolly resolutions, confident in the rhetorical distance that it affords. They will write efficiency and public order, and then sign a page with a flourish. In the cellar below their offices, the funnel of consequence narrows to a single wooden plank. The chronicler follows the ink to the wood and the wood to the remand. To meticulous notation, seeks to join the two. The mechanics of sealing are considered with the same attention as arrest and descent. Once the body is in the shaft, measures are taken to ensure finality. A wooden cover, iron bolted, sits flush with the cobbles. Its hinges are greased and its grain worn by years of being closed upon sound. The seam is packed with earth and lime. Water channels divert rainfall away from the mouth, deadening any accidental path for rescue. Even scavenging birds are discouraged with iron rings and sharp spikes. The pit is not a single act but a maintenance project. There are scheduled times for checks, a list in the watch ledger that names who oils the hingen and who replenishes sand in the chamber. The work is mundane. Sweeping the rim, replacing a rotten plank, perfuming the smell of rosemary to mass rot, that ordinariness is part of its terror. It is a system with inventory and a budget line. Still, maintenance fails. There are irregularities that leak. An unfastened hinge, a guard who lingers in a mode of pity and leaves a rope loop loosened, a cellar wall that collapses in a wet season. Such failures are the openings by which memory enters the ledger. Families note a returned shrine or a smear of blood at a threshold. Children in the square point to a stone where they swear the ground hums. These are the small subversions that assure the chronicler there is a truth that bureaucratic language cannot quite close. The chronicler catalogs sound as a forensic object. He writes clinical notes on how a cree behaves in the vertical shaft, early high frequencies that dissipate in the first few breaths, resonant mid-tones that rebound from damp walls. a long decay that can be heard days later in conditions of stillness and frost. He measured how cobble patterns alter vibration and how dampness prolongs the last audible notes, noting that a frozen rim can send a brittle, clearer signal for longer distances because the cold lows eruption. He records tests. A rope drop to measure delay, a coin struck against stone to trace harmonic reflections, a tally of how many seconds pass before a sound vanishes in different weather conditions. He constructs a map of acoustic memory with the same disdain for sentiment that defies his person. The effect is grotesque only if one confuses method with malice. His coldness is a device to make the evidence speak without the filter of outrage. Ritual and spectacle are phases of the peace socialization. Public rumor turns a closet-in governance into a theater of terror. The council relies on that theater to maintain compliance, but ritual requires actors. The guards and the warden inhabit their roles with ceremony. The removal of gloves before orders, the formal counting of prisoners on fingers, the slow pronunciation of ledger entries as if to sanctify them. These acts are meant to make an absent credible, make disappearance feel like governance. The removal of gloves is a repeated motif. It announces a change from the ordinary to the exceptional, a ritual undressing that legitimates erasure. There are moments of human resistance that undermine ritual. A guard hides a scrap of bread. A woman in the square stares too long and asks questions. Such acts rarely alter policy, but they complicate the ledger. The chronicler looks for his gesture evidence that a human record persists. He notes, with clinical empathy, the patterns of Toji Huchito remember. A neighbor who learns as long as a mnemonic, a child who names stones in the square to keep track of time, a mother who presses her palm to the cobble where her son last stood. He records how these small practices accumulate into clandestine memorials. A ring placed under a loose stone, a knot tied in the hem of a dress to signify absence, a line of chalk drawn along a threshold. These are not protests in the street, they are the private economies of grief. At the gauge measure of the pit is its durability. The shaft survives seasons, officials, and outbreaks. It adapts. New seal, new rims, new acoustic profiles tuned by different hands. The city ethnic shift, but the pit's capacity to convert life into ledger shorthand remains robust. This adaptability is what alarms the chronicler. It is the institutional memory of concealment. HR changes in practice across decades. The substitution of hem for flax in ropes, the trimming of an oak rim after rot, the insertion of iron bands when the price of timber rose. Each small alteration is a proof attention, an investment in continuance. The final sections of this chapter catalog the aftermath. Families adjust, the market resumes, and municipal language threads itself back into neutral tones. The ledger returned to commerce and tax lists, but echoes remain. A name crossed out with a shaky hand, a ledger page read, and stained bay tears, a scrap letter pressed into a seam. The chronicler collects these artifacts with the same romantic care he applies to measurements. They are proofs not of dramatic rescue but of endurance. The small resistances that the city's machinery cannot fully grind away. This chapter concludes not with redemption but with a call to memory in administrative form. The chronicler files his notes, indexing incident, dates, and acoustic observations. He sets the ledger beside the sealed covers and notes the page number where names recur. He relates the disappearance of coppers with an uptick in certain theft reports. He charts periods when the pit's use rose with market downturns and when it slackened under better harvests. The pit persists as a method. The hope is procedural. That a record, however cold, will become the substrate for accountability. That is the chronicler's wider. That a methodical, unfeeling account will be harder to ignore than favorite outrage. These pages do not demand dramatic closure. They insist instead on the work of looking, assembling detail after detail, matching the cadence of action to their consequences, preserving the small human marks the apparatus tries to efface. In the end, the pit is both less and more than a story. It is a municipal decision-made material, and as such it can be measured, catalogued, and perhaps undone. The chronicler leaves no moral flourish, he leaves a ledger. The ledger will remain, patient and damn ink stained, waiting for the reader who wields all the arithmetic of remembrance. The pit's echo lingers beyond the stone. It carries in the markets at the broad silences, in the ledger S gaps, and in the gestures of those who keep the memory alive. History tread on high what is it, but the scratches remain. The chronicler will keep recording because the record is to provide that slight and stubborn resistance to erasure. Their scream faded, but the story rots only if no one writes down the shape of the rot. This ledger is the attempt not to save those who were lost, but to ensure they are not forgetfully swallowed by the city that made the pit effective. The chapter's closing pages catalog the artifacts recovered from the periphery. A single shirt with a fresh strap, a torn scrap of letter folded into a fist, a ledger page sopped with an unknown stain. Each item is recorded with the chronicler's precision, measurements, conditions, and annotation of where it was found. He notes the sure SO worn on the left side for someone who favored a crop, the ink on the scrap that suggests a hasty greeting or last play, the stain S spread pattern as if the paper were pressed against something wet. These trivialities are the bookends to the pit's bureaucracy. They insist stubbornly on the presence of the human in a system designed to obliterate it. When the reader closes this chapter, the cobbles of the square should feel different. Not because the pit has been toppled, it remains and is likely to remain, but because the act of reading converts silence into witness. The chronicler's recording is an instrument that turns municipal quiet into evidence. It is not a remedy. It is the slow, cold coating of what was done beneath the feet of a city that preferred the relentless to messy process. It is a record that, if preserved, may one day be turned into a different motion, inquiry, memory, or the long, bureaucratic work of undoing the pit's method. Until then, the stone keeps its echoes, and the chronicler keeps his pen. The Hole of Nuremberg is not a single event but an apparatus, a municipal habit hardened into practice. It sits in records like a blank stitched into ledger pages, a place named and then avoided, an administrative solution that aids people. To read the civic books with the chronicler is to feel the ritual of erasure take shape, arrests annotated with shorthand, the sending down of a chained body as if handing off an accounting problem. This chapter follows the machinery that produced the pit, the men who kept it functional, and the ghosts who remained when the city tried to tidy its conscience. The setting is a city prison beneath uneven cobbles, a low-voltage cellar warmed only by candle flame and the breath of the living. The air is perpetually damp. The stone sweat dark ruins where centuries of water have found their way. Municipal buildings pressed down above ground, their fire-eyed blunted by soot and tray. Their carved insignia soft with the soot of guards and chimneys. Beneath them, the pit is a vertical void bored into the bedrock, a place visited in the horse the magistrates preferred to forget aloud. That forgetfulness is municipal policy. Not a matter of denying things, but of folding them away within bureaucracy, of viewing the unseen a ledger line and then closing the book. At the center of the record sits Warden Albrecht, a man of careful posture and realized cruelty. He is not dramatic. There is no theatricality in his movements, no flourish in his cruelty. His authority arrives in the small formalities he keeps. The checking of the ledger aloud before a cell, the removal of gloves before signing the paper, the ornamental iron keys at his hip, heavy as judgment and polished to a quick gleam. He understands the pit as an instrument of governance. Where magistrates fear scandal, Albrecht offers finality. He keeps receipts, he keeps signatures, he teaches those below him to do the same. For him the moral arithmetic is simple. The city is maintained by order, and order must sometimes be politely severe. Opposite Albrecht is the nameless prisoner. Not a single man so much as a composite voice stitched from scraps of testimony, a torn letter, an iron mark around an ankle. He will not save the city. He has no power. His role is to witness, to be ground into the mechanism until only markings remain. He stares at the floor. He breathes shallowly. When he folds the scrap of a letter into a fist, that small action is stubborn in its modesty. It becomes a canned rebellion against erasure. The letter need not be legible to be deafened. Existence is sufficient. Here's evidence of what the book's gloss of the human edge administrative neatness. And between ledger and cries the chronicler, who writes with a pen deep in coolness. His vocation is to record without melodrama. He's methodical, unflinching, and his voice is an apparatus of truth, and much Albrecht's ledger is an apparatus of forgetting. When other men would subtly color or excuse, he annotates measurement and time. His present answers that this is not poor rumor. He will map the procedure, name the dates, trace the motions of the rope and the footsteps and the keys. Where citizens want to forget, the chronicler will make the oubliette legible. He will measure the angle of the ladder, list the names of witnesses, note the peculiarities of a warder's handwriting. He calls both omission and evidence, because to suppress small details is to manufacture comfort. This is a city that values order above mercy. Crimes are sometimes obvious, sometimes invented. Accusation and currency as common as sky. A man can be stripped of his livelihood by a rumor as light as a breath, and the rumor can be set in motion by an unpaid debt, a jealous neighbor, or a magistrate's desire to silence a troublesome son. A merchant missing payment, a daughter accused of witchcraft because she would not marry, a foreign vagrant who spoke in another tongue. These are routinized as causes for detention. The pit is reserved not for the duly convicted after trial, but for those civic machinery decides best to make disappear. On paper, the procedure is efficient and coldly ceremonial. A name is written in the ledger, a token exchange is struck, a signature is made, and a list of witnesses is set on. Warden Albrecht stamps his authority with heavy iron keys and a clipped voice. He moves through the prison counting fingers and checking marks as if keeping inventory. There is ceremonial precision to the act of consigning a body to the pit. The ritual is designed to be forgettable because it looks like routine administration. The chronicler rises into permanence because the city must keep a record of its economy of men, and because the chronicler believes that naming is a kind of moral accounting. The pit itself resists description that would honor it. It is a vertical one in stone, carved and expanded over generations. Is ringed by a cellar door and a ladder that descends into dark like a fist into a sleeve. Some behaves badly there. The long shaft bends case is deliberate and cruel. A scream tones down will smear into an unending hall that returns as rumor. Those who have worked the edge learn it to time the lowering, so the sound of a drop body would be masked by the city's other noises. A market bell occurs on cobbles. The late laughter of tavern wars, yet sound is a stubborn thing. Sometimes it finds a way to travel, catching on mortar and returning to the stone in a way that is nearly human. Sometimes, more dangerous, the city keeps its head down and still it cannot move the thing it ordered. A ledger entry from a cold autumn night reads in the chronicler's hand, sent one mail, cause, that disturbance, delivered to Hole, witness said. Albrecht to warders, municipal clerk. Time let, it is shorthand and it is murder, and yet no word for murder appears. The vocabulary of erasure is administrative. The city prefers institution and an absent rather than to explain a death, preferring a neat account where the weight of a body is replaced by the weight of ink on a page. Prisoners rather the pit experience abasement first. They are stripped if their clothing is deemed of value to the prison. Garments are inventoried, valued, and queued for sale or use. They are fed rarely. The ration is punishment and, in Albrecht's view, an economy of scarcity to be administered with pedantry. Shackles bite the flesh and leave iron marks that will later be recorded as evidence of custody in the margin of a report. The handling is methodical. A pair of warders will move the prisoner along them stone corridors, past cells where men press their faces to grates and watch the procession in fearful silence. The nameless prisoner remembers his was too bright in memory, a series of candle-lit frames where faces blow into stone and a new face, his, becomes a vocabulary of fear. There are rules in the warden's mind. They are harsh and practical. The pit is to be used sparingly, so that its deterrent power remains intact. is to be used when a public execution would be inconvenient or when an official wants a problem to be solved quietly. When scandal threatens to scuttle trade or public confidence. It is to be used when magistrates are nervous. The warden keeps it administratively mundane so that no single man is tempted to mythologize the act. Efficiency for our wretched is the most moral posture of all. Cruelty is softened into procedure. There is, to him, something almost hygienic in tedious paperwork. Yet this makes cruelty quieter, not less present. The narration recalls the descent as a sequence of measured touches. A hand on the shoulder, the creak of the ladder, the scrape of bargain rope against a pulpit of stone. The rope itself is swayed with time. It has the smell of oil and old sweat, and its strands of polished dark ware hands have gripped it in generations. Sometimes prisoners were lowered with blankets, other times with a simple loop. Sometimes they were pushed or guided by a sharp shove. The method varied by the warden's mood and the logistics of the night. None of the variations were merciful. The result was always the same. A body removed from sight and accounted for in a ledger line. Some who were sent to the pit were not bound to stay there instantly. There were cases where a man was left to hang in his restraints or stripped of boots and left to freeze in niches cut into the shaft. There were others who were placed in alcoves, left to obey the dark until the city decided his fate. These half-measures were cruel because they sustained hope. The worst cruelty is not a sharp strike but drawn-out erasure that lets the spirit linger with expectation. A cruelty made of waiting imaginings of rescue that never come. Men survived for days in such niches, and their voices became part of the city's nights, pulling at shutters and swing dread into domestic rooms. The troller compiles testimony and municipal record into a single narrative geometry. He arranges ledger entries against witness statements, cross-hatching them like stonework. He annotates when the warden's handwriting grows cramped, when the iron ring was noted in the margin, when the warder's names repeat across months. He dissects the pattern. A spy in pit you say after a trade embargo, a cluster of consignments following an obrero plago when municipal coffers needed the quiet of fewer moths. There is an economy here. The pit is one of the city's ways of balancing accounts. The ledger will, on some nights, look less like law and more like bookkeeping. Rows of names become a ledger of human shortage. The hand that counts coins and the hand that seals away breath are the same. Rumor travels differently from ledger lines. In the market, an overheard story will become an elaboration, and those elaborations solidify into myth. The pit's acoustics feed rumor into city life. Children chant a half-remembered rhyme about a shoe left at dawn. A washerwoman claims to have found a smear of dark residue on a cobblestone where a cat turned sharply late into the night. A baker swears he woke it to the sound of someone sobbing that could not have come from any neighbor. These small testimonies are dismissed by officials and treasured by those who wish the truth to be known. The chronicler preserves both kinds of evidence, the formal and the informal. Because omission of the latter would be its own lay, there are also administrative defenses. Magistrates will argue that secrecy prevents unrest, that public spectacle escalates violence, that the pit is more humane than other punishments. They will point out the quieter order of the city, the uninterrupted grain shipments, the fewer uprisings. They will cite the efficiency of a system that removes the tension of this without the destabilizing pageantry of public display. But the ledger quarters their claims by showing clustering, by demonstrating that the hall is empty with the same rhythm as municipal need. The pattern suggests that expedi replaces justice. When the ledger's columns did noticeably in favor of consignments, after a set of fines is levied, the pretext to order grows thin. Human beings respond to a system at scale with small rebellions. In the prison, these take the shape of letters folded and hidden in the hem of a tunic, of a warder who will not lower a rope without first slipping a scrap of bread into the hand of the condemned. There are stories of a warder who, late one winter, refuses to witness the sealing of a pit and was quickly moved to another post. His refusal is recorded as a transfer with no accompanying moral. A woman who worked at the scribe desk would sometimes pause before stamping the delivery receipt, and someone down in a cell would feel that pause as a keenness. The chronological records toss exceptions like footnotes that do not erase the main text. They are a reminder the system is not monolithic, that there are people who act in ways not entirely prescribed by ledger, small fissures of conscience within the machinery. Not all who were lowered vanished instantly. There are accounts of a slave who survived for days, their voices raw, calling against stone. The sound became a part of the city's architecture. It threaded between roofs and through alleys, tugging at the hems of people as they moved. Some claim they heard the voice of a mother who had been sent down by mistake, her calls both pleading and precise. Others swear they have heard laughter in the stone, laughter that is not drawn a sort of stunned endurance. The chronicler resists such language. He records what is verifiable, what can be cross-checked with signatures and timestamps. Yet he cannot deny the evidence of altered municipal modes on nights when the pits sang longer than usual. Watchfulness increased. Patrols were altered. The city closed shutters and scalded windows as if to keep a sound from entering. Even the magistrates felt a shift. They called extra meetings, terminus thus and short, and some sent men to prod the ledger for mistakes. The last confessions are often ambiguous, and often unreliable in the ways confession tends to be. They are shaped by necessity and by the hope that telling a story might make someone remember. The pit's last confessions, in the ledger and in scraps, are short practical. A man will admit to stealing food, to speaking ill a magistrate, to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The chronicler records his words because even in a day where testimony has weight, confessions, however corset, alter the paper trail. He pairs them with the administrative signatures that turned confession into disappearance, and he notes the interval between the admission and the consigning. A confession written with a smudged hand is marked as such. An admission made without witnesses is annotated with a question. Such marginally are the chronicler's small resistances. After a time, stories of the pit changed the city's ritual. A new law might be proposed. Witnesses would argue morally in the council. Some councillors, whose consciences were neither immaculate nor wholly corrupt, would whisper about reform. Yet the same councillors often accepted sealed sentences when it protected their own interests. Reform arrived in increments. A regulation about witness count here, a limit on the number of consignments there. New language requiring a clerk's certification. These tweaks rarely touched the root of the practice because the root was deeper than law. The pit existed where civic need and moral cowardice met. Paper cannot alter appetite. Laws could perfect the process of concealment rather than dismantle it. In the epilogue of this chapter, the city must lie with memory. The cobbled stones can be swept and the municipal books can be bound and hidden. But the traces remain. A single shore found at Zone can testify more eloquently than 100 pages of official dialect. A smear of something dark on an alley wall can gather neighborhood lore and become a memorial of silence. The chronicler, who is committed to truth as an act of recording, keeps his notebook, an iron-bound lantern, and continues to write, to label, to map. He believes in the slow work of numbing, believes that even if his pages cannot out-alter the ledger's power, they can at least refuse to be blank. He marks the margins with the kinds of small indignities men do not like to see. The pattern of consignments, the names that repeat, the relationships between municipal economy and municipal cruelty. This chapter is a record not just of the technicalities of cruelty, but of its social mechanics. The pit is not merely a home, it is an index of municipal priorities. It reveals how a society organizes silence into policy, how routines of administration can be repurposed to produce death without the appearance of malice. The real horror is not always in violent spectacle, but in the way violence becomes steady and legible, in the way accountability is smoothed into a leisure line. The Hole of Nuremberg is a lesson in how institutions can remodel cruelty into a kind of civic hygiene. The Hole of Nuremberg did not consume only bodies. It consumed memory in certain times and preserved it in others. It taught the city a kind of hygiene. So we record, close the lid, move on. Yet whatever the city did to conceal its edges, the rhythms of human weakness continued to trace them. The nameless prisoner kept folding his scrap of a letter even when his hands were thin and raw. The chronicler continued to annotate the margins. A warder occasionally turned his face from the door and walked home smelling them leather and shame. Those small acts, preserving a scrap, pausing a signer, carrying an extra loaf, are the frayed thread by which memory resists erasure. Centuries later, when the city speaks of its past, it will not be able to make the pit vanish entirely. The stone remember the pressure of boots. Mortar holds a memory like a scar. The ledger remembers names. The few dare to speak left marks, marginalia rumors that hardened into song, a washerwoman smear that could not be explained away. The moral ledger of the city will always include the Hole of Nuremberg as a stain. A municipal expedient chosen in time of discomfort and preserved because convenience allowed it. Centuries passed, but the pain lingered, lodged in the turns of stairways and in the discipline of archival hands. The municipal records of Nuremberg do not speak in ordinary words. They list names with numbers, seal impressions, and the measured fall of minutes between arrest and erasure. Where other archive keepers and tasses, the prison ledgers keep a subtraction. The slow accounting of men moved from the public square into a subterranean absence. By the 15th century, the pit beneath the old city prison had become an instrument as routine as a docket. What the chronicler records here is not a pleading for emotion but a ledger of method. How procedural political necessity and a particular architecture combined to make disappearance a municipal technology. The preferred to in contemporary scraps and municipal whispers as the Hole of Nuremberg sat under the cobbles of the western quarter, its multitudes beneath planks and a ceremonial trapdoor. Above ground the city maintained its guilds and sermons, its market cries and municipal proclamations. Below under stone saturated with centuries of rain and trade, a vertical shaft descended beyond the reach of ordinary torches. The shaft is described in several depositions, both narrower and deeper than memory allowed. A vertical well that swallowed sound until a single human voice became a thin thread of air and tense silence. This count is assembled from ledger entries, a handful of municipal seals, 3 surviving notations by an anonymous jailer, and a composite testimony given years later by a man who called himself nothing more than a nameless prisoner. Where gaps exist, the journaler fills them with material inference grounded in architecture and contemporary penalty procedure. The tone is clinical because the practice itself was procedural, designed to be legal, efficient, and deniable. The pit's original construction predates a period under review. It began as a refuge shaft, a wallet drop built by Roman masons and widened with medieval mortar. Over time, the municipal stewards found uses for vertical void beyond refuge, cisterns, ventilation wells, eventually a disposal chamber. The shaft's mason work is notable. Good stone and plaster line its upper 100 feet. The lower reach became rough-hewn, where the masons abandoned fine finish for the convenience of darkness. Rainwater pooled in minor ledges. Mineral veins stained stone at torpedo dam. The shaft's acquisition may soon behave unpredictably. The vertical corridor acted as a resonator. Sudden sharp sound became long, low chords. The effect was not merely acoustic theater. It altered perception. A scream dropped into those stones did not end. It reverberated, layered into itself, and lasted long enough to unsettle any who heard it from above. Warden Albrecht administered the pit. He appeared in every ledger entry bearing the signature of municipal permission to remove a prisoner from ordinary custody. His name is frequently accompanied by an ornate iron key impression and a notation of purpose that favor terms like maintenance of order and final municipal disposition. Where other wardens use the execution or corporal punishment, Albrecht's decisions emphasize disappearance as deterrent. He operated by municipal law's textual wiggle room. If someone was to a private holding and later found to have escaped or to have perished by misadventure, the city could close the case in an hour and recover its linen and seals. Albrecht's professional life is visible in small, repeatable gestures recorded in marginalia and in a number of surviving seals. He adopted bureaucratic ritual as his instrument. The iron ring, ledgered with a municipal cipher, left a distinctive imprint in what that appears with disquieting regularity. Addition to his impressions a brief formulae, by order of the warden, for preservation of civic peace, not to be entangled in litigants' claims. These formulae were transacted in wax and parchment. They convert discretion into paper-bound justification. In one series of entries, a break annotation appears 12 times in the space of 6 months, each transfer logged with precise detail. Date, horror, descriptive cloth of prisoner, and seal for retrieval of personal effects. The ledger shows an economy in which administrative repetition produces legitimacy. The process was standardized. Prisoners were held in the public cells until the morning of transfer. A record was struck in a ledger, name, offense, and the municipal seal stamped at the bottom with a thumb of wax pressed by Albrecht's iron ring. At dawn a card arrived. The prisoner, bound at the wrists and often hooded, was led to the courtyard under a blanket of municipal silence. The chroniclers not emphasize timing. The transfers occurred when household activity and market cry masks shone. The city just foggy mornings or days of heavy rain when water on cobbles would soften the soundscape. Some records mark specific weather notations. Mist and dense cloud appear addressing to names associated with disappearances. The cuts wrought matters. Rather than go by the main thoroughfares, the wardens preferred a back road that skirted mercantile warehouses, where few worked before the bell of noon. Narrow alleys permitted concealment. A municipal rope crew, 2 men experienced with lowering gear, handled the descent. The rope used was not ordinary hem. It was a municipal issue halter, washed and stored near the trapdoor. It absorbed sound when moved. The strands muffled with animal fats, which reduced the snap against stone edges. The chronicler's ledger reports show marginally a note about rope maintenance. Oiled thrice monthly, inspect for chaff. The maintenance of the disposal tool was bureaucratic as anything else. Mechanically, the lowering was precise. The prisoner's arms were bound across the chest and wrists lashed together. A secondary tether was fixed that allowed the crew to release the body beyond the lip of the shaft. In several reconstructed sketches, the lowering platform is small. A plank bed, sufficient for the body's weight but narrow enough to prevent footing. Guards stood at fixed intervals. Eyes cast downward to the opening as the prisoner passed beyond visible reach. The chronicler notes a further detail borne by a single, later account. The prisoners was even no light. Torches would have revealed features and made salvage possible. Complete darkness ensured that those who fell into the lower well had no orientation. In darkness, they could not claim. The shaft's contours, slick with condensation, filled with uneven outcrops, serve as an engineered trap. The role of sound cannot be overemphasized. The pit's acoustic properties made it both efficient and cruel. When a human voice begins as a shriek and is drawn down a vertical stone column, the initial high frequencies are absorbed and the lower harmonics remain. The resulting echo stretched the original sound into a slow, unmoving moan. Contemporary onlookers recorded that the effect persisted for hours. Voices rotted into a long lament. One note states, it is likely that the phenomenon is partly physiological. Human memory retains the initial spike of shock and then hears the stretched remainder as an ongoing event. Politically, the city leveraged this. The lingering sound above ground functioned as a warning. You may not see the body, but you will know precisely what was done. The extended echo produced a communal red that was carefully managed. The fable and common phrases that developed around those hours are themselves evidence. Merchants recorded in their private daybooks that deliveries were delayed when a transfer was scheduled. A butcher knows no traffic from West Way, strange crying at dawn beneath a dead letter cross with a municipal seal. A priest marginalia in a parish leisure cautions parishioners to refrain from open complaint during certain market days. The echo did not simply terrify. It disciplined speech. The chronicler finds in such incidental notes a pattern. The city did not simply hide bodies. It curated the moment of disappearance to produce a civic lesson without spectacle. The nameless prisoner, as fragmentary testimony, given years after his survival, provides a contrasting interior perspective to the ledger exterior measurements. He describes the mouth of the pit as a black jog of light, a ring of weathered stone with a trapdoor that swallowed the air. He remembers the feel of the rope squash under his palms and the coldness of the shackle near his ankle. He does not recount the act as a single moment, but as an accumulation of procedural indignities. Recitation of the offense, stamping of the seal, the slow alignment of rope. He remembers the gorgeous ceremonial removal of gloves before lowering him, and the sound of keys-like ritual percussion. When lowered, he recalls the sudden removal of horizon. The chronicle tone here is careful. He was words are not reproduced verbatim in the ledger. Instead, the crueler paraphrases them to preserve anonymity and to protect the man who gave them. That protection is self an administrative decision. The nameless prisoner had reason to remain unnamed. Fear of reprisal, shame, or a desire to ensure that his account would be read as evidence rather than entreaty. His survival is recorded in a single municipal margin entry. Recovered, survived as Saint Mysticenist, later freed, C5. The follow-up file offers scant illumination. The jailer's note, crisp, more functional than compassionate, record the occurrence in the tone of property inventory. It is the unusual friction of that tone against a human voice that most unsettles the chronicler. Survival appears an administrative irregularity to be explained away. There is evidence that the pit was used beyond simple disposal. Several ledger fragments indicate that prisoners designated as political agents or undesirable witnesses were subjected to interrogation prior to descent. The interrogation methods were not extraordinary in their cruelty but in their administrative framing. Municipal officers kept procedural notes. The time interrogations commenced, who observed it, and which municipals authorized removal. The chronicler infers from this marginalia that the city sought confessions, information, and a record that could be folded into civic paperwork. A forced statement, a signature, a sealed admission, all can breathe by the shaft's anonymity. The presence of observer appears important to the municipal apparatus. Witnesses often ascribe a mercantile representative and occasionally a truth official, signed notes verifying presence. The signatures became instruments of collective responsibility and of plausible deniability. By requiring multiple attestations, the city converted a causative act into a ceremony witnessed transaction. The notations of witness present require alongside a seal of final municipal decision. The chronicler reads in his deliberate legalism. By constructing a performative chain of custody, the city manufactured accountability that stopped at the sealed ledger. Equally important are the ephemera around the pit. Discarded scraps of letters, a soul sure, a record of a ledger line struck to in brownish stain. These small artifacts appear in municipal inventories as either evidence or unclaimed. One notable item, catalogued in a later municipal purge, is a torn scrap of a letter found in a cell, folded and smoothed into a fist-based writer before transfer. The chronicler cites this as the nameless prisoner as signet item, the single physical trace a prisoner could use to mark existence. The city's handling of subjects shows a bureaucratic logic. Belongings were inventoried and then absorbed or destroyed. This procedure limited possibility for later claims. The inventory record not only items but the procedure for dealing with them. Effects were listed in triplicate. Copy for the prisoner's S-file, one for the storehouse, and one for municipal disposal. Small things, crochet, scrap cloth, were lowered and then placed in a municipal chest labeled unclaimed. The chest's keys appear mentioned in a number of ledger entries, and one marginal note records that the chests were opened twice in a decade. On one occasion, an attending officer noted that a shoe matched a missing person description. On another, a letter fragment matched handwriting in a petition that had been earlier filed. The process of inventory and reabsorption turned individual traces into administrative residue. Warden Abretes' personal rituals reveal the institutional mind behind the horn. He kept a ledger pouch stained from years of ink and other fluids. The pot contained receipts for rope maintenance, ledger shields, and occasionally a thin, ceremonial dagger kept as symbolic authority rather than daily weapon. Albrecht's mannerisms. He counted prisoners on his fingers slowly, removed gloves before issuing orders, and checked the ledger aloud. Were not mere crisp but theatrical acts of authority. Each gesture reasserted municipal legitimacy, covering the arbitrary into a performance of law. The chronicler's report suggests that To's gesture had intended and unintended audiences. The guards, the citizens who glimpsed the transfer, and the traders who would later read the city's silence as protection of order. Albrecht so curated the language of the ledger with what might be called administrative euphemism. Entries that in other towns would read executed or hanged were rendered as file disposition or removed or private holding. A single phrase, structure under civic order, appears regularity and with no further explication. These phrases allowed for the existence of two parallel truths, a public record that spoke of legality, and an unrecorded reality of absence. The chronicler notes that the presence of the phrase in so many entries normalized a vocabulary of disappearance, making the act itself part of municipal parlance. The architectural and civic mechanics of the pit allowed for several calibrated abuses. By denying a corpse talking, the city severed the cycles of mourning that forced accountability. By placing the act in darkness and rain, it reduced witnesses. By maintaining procedural paper trails that framed disappearance and legal disposition, it insulated the officials from recourse. Such a system made cruelty ordinary. The pit altered show behavior. Families learned to avoid certain alleys. The marketplace sang fewer candid laments about the wardens. Merchants altered trade pattern when a known agitator disappeared. The echoing screams became municipal cautionary tales that could be recited without naming the victims. Municipal authority folded suffering into its governance. In the chronicler's view, this is less a simple story of savage individuals and more a study of administrative capture. When institutions are permitted to make a rash routine, disappearance becomes an unremarkable tool of governance. There were, of course, mistakes. The records include instances of incomplete descent, when a prisoner's body lodged on a ledge and was later recovered by laborers. Tone moments exposed the practice, a retrieval, a hurry burial, revised ledger entry. One particularly notable error forced the city to bribe a family in exchange for silence. The ledger there is blunt, compensation paid, see voucher, family satisfied, case closed. In another instance, a laborer reported a fragment of laffocoque on a lower ledge. The city paid the laborer and altered the time entry to conceal the recovery. Such instances demonstrate the system, for how its careful bureaucratic engineering was brittle. When the mechanism failed, the municipal managers were forced into the same crude moral economy as anyone else. Compensations, hush money, and petty justice traded in private. The records of those errors are worth careful reading because they reveal how denial is actively produced. In one entry, an auditor later comments, albeit briefly, that the booby trap alignment misjudged that a body remained lodged for 2 days. The response from the mayoral office was procedural, a closed session, a sealed vote, a directive to renew trapdoor fittings. The response was not an apology so much as a correction of technique. The chronicler observes that the language used to remedy failure often mirrors the language of the original offense. The municipal apparatus treats the moral problem as a mechanical one. The pit's final phase is as much about memory as it is about law. Over the following century, municipal reforms, religious scrutiny, and changing legal norms slowly make practice less tolerable. Still, strong residue remains in the stones and in legendalia. The chronicler's final entries are not moralizing condemnations but precise observations. The trapdoor's hinges were replaced twice in a decade. The rope maintenance record ceases in a single year with no accompanying notation for way, and an unsealed ledger page marks the day municipal auditors first demanded explanation. This small discrepancy reveals how practices they not away a single dramatic event, but through administrative attrition, reform requests, and the slow unraveling of the theater of authority. An auditor's memorandum preserved among the municipal reforms is thus increase transparency of custody, report reason for removal, preserve public visibility. The memorandum appears the time coincides with a shift in language and practice. Where once entries read final municipal disposition, they begin to specify transferred to provincial custody or escorted to ecclesiastical inquiry. Whether these changes were substantive or cosmetic is hard to determine from the ledger alone. The chronicler note ritual and vocabulary often precede practice, yet the presence of repeated audit notation marks the beginning of an unpicking. This account preserves the mechanisms of disappearance, because the mechanism is the point. The Hole of Nuremberg did not exist only to kill. It existed to render the civic body capable of erasure without rupture. The pit's architecture, the warden's rituals, the rope crew's maintenance, the acoustic design that stretches screams into public dread. Each element formed part of a civic strategy. The nameless prisoner single scrap of the and the on. Teruna Shoah, the human artifacts that insist upon remembrance. The chronicler offers this record as an act of archival recovery, not to associate horror with language, but to map the procedural logics that allowed cruelty to become routine. The whole remained a home. The city continued its maquettes, and for a time the edges did what they were meant to do, dig complaints. In the end, the municipal ledger is the most direct witness. It records names and dates, and in its omissions it reveals what council sought. The possibility of governance without accountable visibility. What the chronicler leaves are not pleas or sermons, but the cold details by which systems can be recognized in any age. Sealed signatures, scheduled transfers, maintained rope, and the careful unashamed notation of erasure. If history has any use here, it is to show how ordinary bureaucracies can sanction nightmares. The Hole of Nuremberg is one nightmare recorded in the language of administration, efficient, procedural, and finally human in its consequences.